The millionaire who extended a hand to save Miss Beatrice's life was no stranger. He was her half-brother, a secret buried for decades, born from the betrayal that destroyed their mother. But before destiny revealed this shocking truth, she was just a humble vendor at the Sweet Auburn Curb Market. Famous for her Brunswick stew and fried pies, she had spent her life cooking with her soul, only to be stripped of everything in one cruel morning. She had no idea that this humiliation was the beginning of a journey to reclaim justice and discover a legacy she never knew she had. If you are listening from anywhere in the world, please leave a comment and subscribe, because some truths need to be spread, no matter how much they may shake your beliefs. There are stories, no matter how painful, that must be told. The aroma of the Brunswick stew floated in the air. It was her pride. She had learned it from her mother and perfected it over the years. Misquote. Beatrice woke up before dawn to cook, to patiently stir, to season with her soul. That day would be no different, or so she thought. "Get out of here, old woman," roared a man in a red vest, with the authority of someone who had already made a decision. Miss Beatrice felt a sharp blow to her chest, her stall, her life. The customers turned to look at her, whispering, but no one did anything. "There must be a mistake," she tried to say. "I've been selling here for 30 years. The man let out a dry laugh. "Today is your last day. Someone else paid for this spot." The chill that ran down her spine wasn't from the cold. It was from the certainty that someone had planned this. And then she saw her. Miss Sharon, the woman who had always wanted to see her fall, smiled smugly. "I warned you, Beatrice. In this business, the one with the money calls the shots." The air smelled of smoke, but it wasn't from the griddle. It was from rage. The market crowd stepped aside. The man in the vest leaned over her. "You have 5 minutes to pack your things, or we'll do it for you." 5 minutes. 30 years reduced to 5 minutes. Miss Beatrice's hands trembled. She couldn't lose everything. Not like this. She bent down to pick up the pot of stew, and at that moment, a hand pushed her. The metal crashed to the ground with a loud bang. The Brunswick stew spilled onto the pavement, forming a dark, thick puddle. Time stood still. The customers watched in silence. Caleb and Clara, hidden behind the stall, watched her with eyes full of tears. Miss Beatrice felt the sting of tears in her own eyes, but she wasn't going to cry. Not in front of them. "Look what you did, Beatrice," Miss Sharon sighed with feigned pity. "Now you've really lost everything." Caleb ran to his grandmother and hugged her tightly. "It's not fair, Grandma." No, it wasn't. But justice didn't exist for the poor. She took a deep breath, swallowing her humiliation. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. "Let's go home, kids." Caleb took her hand tightly. But before they left, he looked at Miss Sharon with a frown. "My grandma is a better cook than you," he said in a firm voice. "And you're going to see, Miss and..." Sharon laughed, paying no mind to a child's words. But Caleb wasn't wrong, because at that moment, Miss Beatrice didn't know it yet, but this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Miss Beatrice walked with slow steps, her hands clutching the only pot she had left intact. She felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. Beside her, Caleb and Clara followed in silence, their little faces reflecting helplessness and sadness. The aisles of the Sweet Auburn Curb Market, which had always been her refuge, now seemed unfamiliar. The gazes of some acquaintances were evasive, while others were filled with pity. But no one dared to help. In the markets, solidarity was lost when the fear of losing one's own livelihood took over. "Grandma, what are we going to do now?" asked Clara in a small voice, hugging her worn-out doll. Miss Beatrice closed her eyes for a moment. She had no answer. She had worked her whole life to provide for her family. She had stayed up countless nights preparing each dish with care, and in a single day, Miss Sharon had taken everything from her. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay strong. "We're going home, my child," she finally said. "We'll figure something out." But inside, fear consumed her. She knew what it meant to lose her spot at the market. If they took your space, you never got it back. There were other streets, yes, but without a fixed location, without loyal customers, how would she survive? Caleb, with a scowl on his face, glanced at his grandmother. He knew she was suffering in silence, and even though he was just a boy, he understood that he had to do something. As they walked through the market aisles, a familiar sound made her stop. Miss Sharon's voice. Fried pies, hot fried pies, Brunswick stew with the oldest and most delicious recipe. Miss Beatrice's stomach churned. Just a few feet from where her stall had been that morning, there was Miss Sharon, smiling shamelessly, offering the same dishes she used to sell. But that wasn't the worst part. On misssile.org, Sharon's table was a cast-iron Dutch oven, identical to the one Miss Beatrice used, the very one in which she cooked her stew every day. Caleb saw it too. "That's your Dutch oven, Grandma." Miss Beatrice felt a lump in her throat. They had stolen it. In the midst of the confusion, as she hastily gathered her things, someone had taken her best pot and given it to her worst enemy. "It's all right, my boy," she said, gently squeezing Caleb's arm. "It's not worth making a scene here." But Miss Sharon had already seen her. "What happened, Beatrice?" she asked with a cynical smile. "Out of a job?" Miss Beatrice didn't answer. It wasn't worth arguing with someone like her. "What a shame," Miss Sharon continued with false sympathy. "But look, I'll be here to take your place. The customers won't miss what was never that good to begin with." Caleb clenched his fists. He couldn't believe the wickedness of that woman. "You're a thief!" the boy blurted out angrily. "You stole my grandma's Dutch oven!" Miss Sharon let out a laugh, but her eyes glinted with a spark of annoyance. "Meddling brat," she muttered, but then returned to her mocking tone. "Look, kid, in this world, the one who knows how to make moves wins. Your grandma is old now. She doesn't have the strength to compete anymore. You'd better learn now that in life, there are winners and there are losers." Miss Beatrice felt something inside her break. It wasn't the Dutch oven. It wasn't even the stall. It was the humiliation. She had worked with dignity her whole life. She had never harmed anyone. She had always trusted that good people would be rewarded. But there was Miss Sharon, triumphant, while she had lost everything. "Come on, Caleb. Clara," she whispered in a tense voice. "It's not worth arguing with these people." "Yes, it is," Caleb muttered, his face red with anger. "You can't let her take what's yours, Grandma." Miss Sharon clicked her tongue. "Oh, how cute. The boy still believes in fairy tales, Miss Saya." Beatrice took her grandson's hand and pulled him away. But as they walked away, Caleb didn't stop looking back. The fire in his eyes didn't die out. He knew his grandmother wouldn't do anything to get revenge, but he would. At that moment, he decided he would find a way to show the world that Miss Beatrice was the best cook in the Sweet Auburn Curb Market. His resolve hardened into a silent promise, a spark of defiance against a world that seemed determined to crush them. Miss Beatrice walked with her head down, holding Caleb's hand tightly, while Clara, with her worn-out doll, tried to keep up. The Atlanta air was thick that afternoon, mixed with the smells of the market that no longer felt like hers. Every step she took moved her away from her routine, her security, from the little she had left in the world. She couldn't stop thinking about the cast-iron Dutch oven on Miss Sharon's table. It wasn't just a pot. It was the same one she had inherited from her mother, the same one she had used to prepare every dish she sold at the market for over 30 years. Now in the hands of her enemy, it felt like a mockery of fate. Caleb, with a frown and clenched fists, was still walking angrily. "It's not fair, Grandma," he muttered suddenly. You can't let that woman steal everything from you like this." Miss Beatrice stopped and looked at him tenderly, although inside she felt the same anger. "My boy, there are battles that are not worth fighting." Caleb looked up, his dark eyes shining with contained fury. "But you didn't lose, Grandma," he insisted. "She robbed you." Miss Beatrice sighed, feeling a lump in her throat. The last thing she wanted was for her grandson to carry that resentment. But how could she explain to him that the world was unfair to the poor? They continued walking until they reached their old apartment building, an old structure with peeling walls and narrow hallways where dozens of families shared a single courtyard, and where privacy was a non-existent luxury. As soon as they entered, the neighbor from across the hall, Miss Joyce, gave them a worried look. "Beatrice? What happened?" she asked, noticing her exhausted expression. Miss Beatrice barely smiled, lacking the strength for long explanations. "I'll tell you later, Joyce. Right now, I need to sit for a moment." The small room where they lived felt colder than usual. It was a reflection of how she felt inside. She left the pot on the stove but didn't light it. She had nothing to cook. The following days blurred into a monotonous haze of silence and sorrow. Beatrice would sit by the window for hours, watching the world go on without her, a world that no longer had a place for her skills. The familiar scent of her own cooking was replaced by the cold, empty air of their apartment. It wasn't just the loss of income that crushed her, it was the theft of her identity. For 30 years, she was the woman of the Brunswick stew, the lady of the fried pies. Now, she felt like a ghost in her own life. Her hands, once so purposeful, now lay idle in her lap. She felt an invisible wall between her and her grandchildren, a wall built of her own shame and despair. Clara sat on the floor, hugging her doll tightly. Caleb watched her for a moment and then looked at his grandmother. "What are we going to do, Grandma?" "Miss?" Beatrice looked at him, feeling the weight of his question in every fiber of her being. What were they going to do? She had no income, no savings. Everything she had was gone with her stall at the market. She sank into the wooden chair by the table. She had never felt so helpless. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Miss Joyce, who came in without waiting for an answer. "Beatrice, honey, I heard what happened at the market." Miss Beatrice looked down. She didn't want more questions, more pity. "If you need anything, just tell me," Miss Joyce continued. "I don't have much, but we can share." Her neighbor's words were sincere, but Miss Beatrice didn't want to depend on charity. "Thanks, Joyce, really. But I'll be fine." The woman looked at her sadly, but didn't insist. "If you change your mind, you know where I am." When she left, Caleb approached his grandmother and rested his head on her arm. "I'll help you, Grandma." Miss Beatrice stroked his hair tenderly. Her grandson had a noble heart, but he was just a child. But life hadn't allowed him the luxury of a normal childhood. Seeing his grandmother work tirelessly from dawn till dusk, Caleb had learned to be observant, to listen to the whispers of adults, and to understand problems far beyond his years. He knew that sometimes a child's determination was the only weapon the poor possessed. The minutes passed in silence until the sun began to set, and the building filled with the voices and laughter of children playing in the courtyard. But inside the small room, everything remained just as somber. Clara fell asleep on the old, worn-out fabric armchair. Caleb was still awake, looking out the window with his arms crossed. Suddenly, he turned with determination. "I'm going to find a way to help you, Grandma." Miss Beatrice smiled wearily. "My boy, don't worry about that. I'll take care of it." Caleb didn't answer. In his mind, an idea was beginning to form. While his grandmother tried to rest, he knew he couldn't just stand by. Tomorrow, he would do something to change their luck. What he didn't know was that fate was already preparing its own move. Caleb woke up before the sun came out. He hadn't slept well. He spent the night tossing and turning, thinking about the injustice his grandmother had suffered. He had to do something. He couldn't stand by and watch Miss Beatrice waste away in sadness. He got up carefully so as not to wake Clara and went out into the building's courtyard. The cool morning air cleared his mind. He had to find a solution. Miss Beatrice was still asleep, her breathing slow but her face tense. Caleb watched her for a few seconds from the bedroom doorway. He had never seen her like this. She had always been strong, always with a smile on her face, despite their poverty. But now, she seemed defeated. He walked down the building's hallway aimlessly, kicking little stones on the ground. It was then that he passed by Miss Joyce's door. The woman was sitting on a small stool, stirring a cup of coffee in a ceramic mug with a metal spoon. "Caleb, what are you doing up so early, kid?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Caleb shrugged. "I couldn't sleep." Miss Joyce sighed, as if she understood exactly what he was feeling. "Your grandma is strong, son. This won't defeat her." Caleb wasn't so sure. His grandmother was strong, yes, but she was human. She needed something to get her back on her feet. He sat on the floor, leaning his back against the wall. "If only there was a way to help her," he murmured. Miss Joyce took a sip of her coffee and looked at him with thoughtful eyes. "You know, the other day I saw something at the bakery by the market," she said suddenly. "They put up a poster about a food competition in Inman Park." Caleb's head shot up. "A food competition?" "Yeah, something about a food festival. I didn't pay much attention, but it looked important." Caleb felt his heart race. That was it. He stood up immediately. "Where did you see that poster?" Miss Joyce, surprised by his enthusiasm, looked at him. "I think on the wall next to the bakery." Caleb didn't wait any longer. He ran through the building's hallways with a single thought in his head: find that flyer. He knew his grandmother wouldn't accept the idea right away, but he would make sure to convince her. The Sweet Auburn Curb Market was already waking up when he arrived. The sun wasn't fully out yet, but the first fruit and vegetable stalls were already in full swing. Caleb moved through the crowd, dodging carts and boxes until he reached the bakery. He searched with his eyes until he found it, stuck to a concrete wall with large, eye-catching letters. It was the flyer he was looking for. Great Food Festival in Inman Park. Show off your culinary talent and compete with the best chefs. Caleb read every word carefully. There was a deadline to register, but there were still a few days left. It was the perfect opportunity. He tore the paper from the wall and ran back to the apartment building. When he entered the room, Miss Beatrice was already awake, sitting at the table with Clara on her lap. "Grandma, look at this," he said, handing her the flyer with excitement. Miss Beatrice took the paper curiously and read it in silence. Her expression changed. "A food competition," she murmured. Caleb nodded enthusiastically. "It's in Inman Park, Grandma. They say it's really important." Miss Beatrice put the paper on the table and sighed. "My boy, these competitions are for professional chefs, for people with degrees in restaurants." Caleb shook his head. "It doesn't say here that you have to be a chef. It just says you have to cook well." Miss Beatrice looked at him tenderly, but also with sadness. "We don't have money, Caleb. To participate in something like that, we would need ingredients, transportation, and I have nothing left." The boy's enthusiasm faded a little. He hadn't thought about that, but he didn't give up. "We can get it," he said with conviction. "We can ask for a loan or save a little. Grandma, this is your chance." Miss Beatrice smiled sweetly but didn't answer. She didn't want to get his hopes up for something impossible. Clara, who had been silent the whole time, suddenly spoke in her soft little voice. "I would like you to cook again, Grandma." Miss Beatrice felt something inside her break. Caleb seized the moment and took her hand. "Grandma, you always say that food isn't just to fill the stomach, but to gladden the heart. If you don't cook, how are we going to be happy?" Miss Beatrice closed her eyes. Her grandchildren needed her, and even though fear paralyzed her, she couldn't leave them without hope. She looked at the flyer again. A food festival, a competition. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her story. It's in our lowest moments that a single spark of hope can feel like a wildfire. Beatrice made a choice not to surrender to despair, but could this small flicker of hope possibly be enough to overcome the mountain of obstacles that lay ahead? Let's find out together. That night, sleep offered no escape. Beatrice lay awake, the flyer a faint shape in the moonlight. Fear and hope waged a silent war within her. The thought of facing a crowd again, of being judged, of failing in front of her grandchildren, was paralyzing. Miss Sharon's mocking laughter echoed in her mind. But then, she thought of her own mother's hands, confidently kneading dough, and the legacy of strength passed down to her. This competition wasn't just about winning money or proving Miss Sharon wrong. It was about reclaiming her own story. It was about telling the world, and herself, that she was more than what had been done to her. By dawn, the war was over. Hope had won. Miss Beatrice spent the rest of the day in silence, with the competition flyer folded in her hands. She had read it at least 20 times, each word engraving itself in her mind. A part of her wanted to ignore it, move on, and accept that her time in the kitchen was over. But another part, the deepest, most rebellious part, clung to a small spark of hope. The look in her grandchildren's eyes haunted her. They believed in her, even when she no longer believed in herself. But there was a problem she couldn't ignore. They had no money. She didn't have ingredients, not even enough to buy some chicken and seasonings to prepare a simple Brunswick stew, let alone pay for the competition's entry fee or transportation to Inman Park. As the afternoon faded, and the apartment building filled with the sounds of clanging pots and children playing in the courtyard, Miss Beatrice took a deep breath. She couldn't give up without trying. Caleb watched her from the table, his eyes shining with excitement. "So, are you going to do it, Grandma?" Miss Beatrice pressed her lips together, not answering immediately. "If I do, we need money." Caleb sat up straight in his chair. "I'll help you get it." Miss Beatrice smiled tenderly. "And how will you do that, my boy?" Caleb frowned, thinking. "I'll find a way." Before Miss Beatrice could respond, Caleb had already stood up and run out the door. The boy went around the apartment building, going from door to door, asking if anyone needed help with anything in exchange for a few coins. He offered to carry grocery bags, sweep courtyards, and even watch the younger children for a while. Not everyone could pay him, but some neighbors gave him a few coins, moved by his persistence. When the sun began to set, Caleb returned with his pockets full of loose change and a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Grandma, look," he said, letting the coins fall onto the table. "I collected something." Miss Beatrice looked at the small pile of quarters and dimes. It wasn't much, but it was more than she expected. "My boy." "I can go out again tomorrow," Caleb said, determined. "If we collect a little more, we can buy what we need." Miss Beatrice felt a lump in her throat. Her grandson, at just 10 years old, was doing everything he could to help her. She couldn't say no. The next morning, Miss Beatrice got up before sunrise, as she used to when she sold at the market. She still hadn't abandoned that habit. As she poured herself some coffee into an enamel mug, she heard footsteps at the neighbor's door. It was Miss Joyce, with a small sack in her hands. "I heard what young Caleb is doing," she said, holding out the sack. "And you're not the only one." When Beatrice opened it, she saw not just corn and spices, but a few onions from Mr. Henderson downstairs and a small piece of chicken from the family in apartment 3B. "It's not much," Miss Joyce admitted, her voice soft, "but we all put a little something in. This market took you from us, but it can't take us from you. Now go on, show them what a real community's cooking tastes like." Beatrice felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with a stove. It was the fire of human kindness. "Joyce, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, miss." Joyce smiled. "Just go win that competition." Miss Beatrice let out a soft laugh and hugged her friend. "Thank you." With that and the money Caleb had collected, they had enough to buy chicken and some other vegetables. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prepare a proper stew. Evening fell on the apartment building, and while most of the neighbors gathered in the courtyard, Miss Beatrice lit the small burner in her kitchen. The aroma of toasted corn filled the air. The seasonings sizzled on the hot cast-iron skillet before being submerged in hot water. Miss Beatrice worked in silence, with a concentration she hadn't felt in a long time. Every movement of her hands was automatic, as if her body remembered the routine better than her mind. So many years of experience, of daily repetitions, of perfecting a recipe that had been passed down from generation to generation. Caleb and Clara watched in silence. "It smells like when we used to sell at the market," Clara whispered with a smile. "Miss." Beatrice didn't respond, but her chest filled with a different kind of warmth, the feeling that, for the first time in a long time, she was doing the right thing. When the stew was ready, she tasted it with a small wooden spoon. The flavor spread across her tongue. It was the taste of her history, of her mother, and of her grandmother. She closed her eyes. "It's ready." Caleb clapped with excitement. "I knew you could do it, Grandma." Miss Beatrice smiled, but her mind was already on what was coming next. The hardest part was still ahead. Now that she had the food ready, she had to face her biggest fear, going out again and fighting for her place, and this time she couldn't afford to lose. The dawn in Atlanta brought with it a cool air, a light breeze that barely moved the curtains of Miss Beatrice's window. The apartment building was still asleep, but she was already on her feet, looking at the cast-iron Dutch oven in which she had cooked her Brunswick stew the night before. The decision was made. She was going to the food festival. Caleb woke up to the sound of his grandmother preparing the last things. The aroma of seasonings and stew still floated in the air. He rubbed his eyes and smiled. "So, we're going, Grandma, miss?" Beatrice, without stopping stirring the pot with a wooden spoon, nodded with a slight sigh. "Yes, my boy, we're going." The excitement on Caleb's face was enough to dispel any doubt. As soon as the sun came up, Miss Beatrice, Caleb, and Clara set off for Inman Park. They took a city bus that moved slowly through the streets, leaving behind the hustle and bustle of the Sweet Auburn Curb Market, and entering a part of the city Miss Beatrice didn't usually visit. It wasn't her world. There, she knew no one, and no one knew her. Caleb carried the pot carefully, as if he were carrying a treasure in his hands. Clara held onto her grandmother's apron with a mix of excitement and nervousness in her small expression. When they arrived at the festival, Miss Beatrice stopped for a moment. The scene was imposing. Large white tents covered the participants' stalls. The chefs wore impeccable white chef's coats with elegant embroidery, some with the names of famous restaurants. Others were talking to journalists and food critics. The air was a combination of spices, grilled meats, and stews that promised stories in every bite. Miss Beatrice felt a lump in her throat. What was she doing here? "Come on, Grandma," Caleb said enthusiastically, pulling her by the arm. She swallowed hard and moved forward. At the entrance, a woman with thick glasses and a formal dress was checking the list of participants. "Name, please." "Miss." Beatrice hesitated for a moment, but Caleb stepped forward. "Beatrice Martin." The woman scanned the list and frowned. "Which restaurant are you from, miss?" Beatrice opened her mouth but didn't know what to say. She didn't have a restaurant. "She's a cook from the Sweet Auburn Curb Market," Caleb said proudly. "Her Brunswick stew is the best in all of Georgia." The woman looked up with a skeptical expression. "From the market?" The silence stretched for a few seconds. Finally, with a sigh, she marked something on the sheet. "All right, your stand is number 24. You have 2 hours to prepare and serve." Caleb smiled and took his grandmother's hand, guiding her to the assigned stall. The space was small, with a stainless steel table and a couple of gas burners. It wasn't much, but Miss Beatrice was used to cooking with less. She didn't need luxuries, she just needed her flavor. Around her, the other contestants looked at her with curiosity and a certain condescension. An old woman with a simple cloth apron amidst chefs in impeccable uniforms. A tall, sturdy man with a black apron embroidered with his name glanced at her and smiled mockingly. "What's the matter, ma'am? Are you lost, miss?" Beatrice ignored him and began to take out her ingredients. She wasn't there to argue, she was there to cook. The fire lit, the aroma of simmering vegetables and the sound of the rich broth bubbling in the thick mixture of the stew were enough for the first curious onlookers to approach her stand. Caleb and Clara helped as they could. Caleb arranged the bowls while Clara wiped any spills on the table with a cloth. Within minutes, the smell of her stew spread through the air. People passing by the other stalls began to turn their heads. There was something about that aroma that awakened memories, something that made them stop. A man in a gray suit and thick glasses, carrying a notebook, approached with curiosity. He took a spoon and tasted a little of the stew. Miss Beatrice watched his reaction carefully. The man closed his eyes for a moment. His expression changed. When he opened them again, he looked at Miss Beatrice with a mixture of surprise and emotion. "This stew tastes like my childhood." Miss Beatrice smiled warmly. "Well-made food always tells a story." The man nodded, writing something in his notebook before walking away. What Miss Beatrice didn't know was that this man wasn't just any visitor. He was one of the judges. As the event progressed, more people came to her stall. Some tasted out of curiosity, others because they had heard someone talking about the flavor of her stew. Even the other chefs began to look at her with less mockery and more interest. But the real change occurred when a tall man with graying hair and an impeccable suit arrived at the stall with a serious expression. Mr. Arthur Sterling, the powerful real estate magnate, observed the bowl in front of him, and then Miss Beatrice. "They say your stew is special," he said in a deep voice. Miss Beatrice didn't respond. She just took a wooden spoon, served a little of the stew, and extended it to him. Mr. Sterling took it elegantly and tasted a bite. The silence became heavy. And then, something happened that no one expected. The man's eyes clouded over for a second, as if something inside him had broken. Miss Beatrice noticed it. It wasn't the typical gesture of approval. It was something deeper. "This flavor," Mr. Sterling whispered, but didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he carefully placed the spoon on the table and fixed his gaze on Miss Beatrice. "I need to speak with you. Food is more than just sustenance. It's memory. It's emotion. That single spoonful of stew did more than impress a wealthy man. It unlocked a door to a past he had long forgotten. His simple request was about to change Miss Beatrice's life, and his own, in ways you won't believe." Miss Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. Caleb and Clara exchanged glances. That day, Miss Beatrice had not only conquered palates, she had awakened memories that were not meant to be remembered. Miss Beatrice felt the air grow heavy around her. The way Mr. Sterling looked at her was not that of just any satisfied customer. There was something more, something in his expression, in the way he held the spoon firmly before placing it on the table. Caleb and Clara stood silently, watching the man's every move. "Ma'am," Mr. Sterling finally said, his voice deep but calm, "I need to speak with you." Miss Beatrice straightened her back and nodded politely. She had no idea who this man was, but his presence commanded respect. "Yes, sir?" "Mr. Sterling looked around, as if searching for a more private place, but the festival was crowded, and the judges were still moving between the stands, tasting dishes. Finally, he sighed and crossed his arms. This stew isn't just a dish. It's a memory. Miss Beatrice frowned slightly. Well-made food always tells a story, sir. Mr. Sterling managed a small smile, but his eyes were still clouded by something Miss Beatrice couldn't quite decipher. How long have you been cooking? Since I was a little girl. I learned from my mother, and she from hers. Mr. Sterling nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he already suspected. And have you ever thought about taking your talent beyond the streets? Miss Beatrice felt a lump in her throat. That thought had tormented her for years. She had always dreamed of having a small place, a spot where people could sit and enjoy her food without her having to carry her pots from one place to another. But dreams didn't fill the stomach or pay the bills. One thinks about many things in life, but it's not always possible, she answered honestly. I can help you, Mr. Sterling's response took her by surprise. Caleb narrowed his eyes, suspicious. Why? Mr. Sterling smiled at the boy's audacity, because talent deserves opportunities. And your grandmother has something that many luxury restaurants have forgotten. She cooks with heart. Miss Beatrice looked down. Was this a real opportunity or just pretty words? Before she could answer, a loud voice interrupted the conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the final phase of the competition. All the contestants stopped and looked towards the stage where the judges were. One of them, a man with white hair and thick glasses, raised his voice. We have selected the 3 finalists whose dishes have represented the true essence of Southern cuisine. The audience fell silent. The first finalist is Chef Keith from the restaurant Georgia's Finest. Applause. The man who had mocked Miss Beatrice at the beginning of the competition lifted his chin with pride. The second finalist is Chef Sadie from the Biscuit Basket. More applause. A young woman with an impeccable apron acknowledged it with a slight bow. The judge looked at his paper one last time before announcing the third name. And our third finalist, Miss Beatrice Martin. A murmur went through the festival. Miss Beatrice felt her heart skip a beat. Caleb and Clara jumped with excitement. Grandma, you made it to the finals! But as her grandchildren celebrated, she noticed how some contestants looked at her with disdain. Not everyone was happy with her advancement. Mr. Sterling gave her a nod. It seems we'll have to continue our conversation later. Miss Beatrice nodded slowly. She didn't know what to think of this man, but something in his eyes told her that she still had much to discover. However, at that moment, there was only one thing on her mind: the grand finale of the competition. And what Miss Beatrice didn't know yet was that the competition wasn't her only challenge. There was someone else who was not at all happy with her success. The sun began to set over the food festival, painting the sky in shades of orange. The last visitors wandered through the stands, tasting the remaining dishes, while the judges deliberated to choose the winner. Miss Beatrice, still impacted by her conversation with Mr. Teen. Sterling stood with Caleb and Clara, who couldn't contain their excitement at seeing her get so far in the competition. Caleb kept repeating it with pride. You're a finalist, Grandma. See? I told you you'd make it. Miss Beatrice smiled and tenderly stroked his cheek. Thank you for believing in me, my child. But despite the happy moment, an uncomfortable premonition ran through her. She knew things wouldn't be so easy. And she was right. A few blocks from the festival, Miss Sharon was listening intently to a man in a gray suit talking on the phone. She had sent one of her acquaintances to investigate what was happening in Inman Park, and the news had left her stunned. It can't be, she muttered, clenching her teeth. That's right, ma'am, said the man on the other end of the line. Miss Beatrice is in the final. And not only that, There's a businessman interested in her. Miss Sharon felt a chill of fury run through her body. Who is this businessman? His name is Mr. Arthur Sterling. He seems to be an influential man. The name didn't ring a bell, but she didn't care. She was not going to let Miss Beatrice advance any further. Since she had kicked her out of the market, she thought she had defeated her for good. But there she was, about to achieve something bigger than she had ever had. No, she would not allow it. She gripped the phone tightly and ordered in a cold voice, "Do whatever it takes, but that old woman cannot win." At the festival, Miss Beatrice was starting to pack up her things when a man with an event vest approached her with an apologetic expression. "Ma'am, we have a problem." Caleb and Clara tensed up. "What's wrong, Miss?" Beatrice asked cautiously. "Some of the judges received a complaint. Someone said that your stew is not yours, that you stole it." "Miss." Beatrice felt the ground move beneath her feet. "What? What are you saying?" "I don't know, ma'am, but there are rumors that your recipe is not original and that you learned it from someone else without permission." Caleb immediately stood up, his fists clenched. "That's a lie. My grandma has been cooking this stew her whole life." The man raised his hands uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, kid, but if there's a formal complaint, the judges have to investigate before giving the results." "Miss?" Beatrice felt rage mix with helplessness. She knew perfectly well who was behind this. "Miss Sharon." Caleb looked at his grandmother with concern. "Grandma, what are we going to do?" "Miss." Beatrice closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm herself. She couldn't let fear paralyze her. Then, when she opened them, she saw Mr. Sterling standing a few feet away, watching her intently. He approached slowly and spoke in a low voice. "I knew something like this could happen." Miss Beatrice frowned. "What do you mean?" Mr. Sterling looked around and then at her. "When someone with talent starts to shine, there are those who will do the impossible to extinguish it." Miss Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. "I didn't steal this recipe. I know, but they don't." Caleb raised his head with determination. "We can prove it, Mr." Sterling managed a small smile. "Of course we can, and I know exactly how." Miss Beatrice looked at him with uncertainty. Something in his tone indicated that this was more than just a simple competition. Mr. Sterling crossed his arms and said firmly, "If you win this festival, Miss Beatrice, I want to make you a proposal. But first, we need to clear your name." Miss Beatrice watched him attentively. "What kind of proposal?" Mr. Sterling smiled slightly, but his eyes reflected something deeper. "One that can change your life." Caleb and Clara held their breath. Miss Beatrice, without realizing it, clutched the edge of her apron tightly. She knew this competition was important, but she never imagined that what was to come was much bigger than she had ever dreamed. Miss Beatrice had barely had time to process what had just happened at the food festival when she received a formal invitation from Mr. Arthur Sterling to cook at an exclusive event in Buckhead. It was an opportunity she would have never imagined. The businessman's words still echoed in her head. "If you win this festival, I want to make you a proposal." She didn't know exactly what that meant, but something inside her told her that this event was more than just a simple dinner for rich people. There was something more behind Mr. Sterling, something she couldn't yet understand. Caleb and Clara were excited but also worried. "So what are you going to do, Grandma?" Caleb asked, sitting at the table in their apartment while his grandmother reviewed the invitation over and over. "Miss," Beatrice sighed, leaving the paper on the table. "I'm going to go." Clara looked at her with wide eyes. "But what are you going to cook?" That was the real question. She didn't have the ingredients she used to use, nor a place to prepare the food. She didn't know how these events worked, if she had to bring everything prepared or cook there. It was a completely unknown world to her. But one thing was certain. If she was going to cook, She would do it as she always had, with soul. The day of the event arrived faster than she expected. A black car with tinted windows appeared at the entrance of their old apartment building at 6 p.m. sharp. No one had ever seen a car like that in that neighborhood. The neighbors came out of their houses, murmuring among themselves. "Whose car is that? Who are they here to pick up? Beatrice?" Miss Joyce, with her arms crossed, approached and looked at Miss Beatrice with a sly smile. "Well, look at you. Are you hiding something from us, Beatrice?" Miss Beatrice shook her head, feeling a mix of nerves and embarrassment. "Nothing like that, Joyce. It's just a food event." "Well, it looks like something bigger than that," replied Miss Joyce, raising an eyebrow. Caleb ran towards the car with enthusiasm. But before opening the back door, a tall man dressed in an impeccable suit got out of the driver's seat. "Miss Martin? Mr. Sterling is waiting for you." Miss Beatrice swallowed and adjusted her apron. It was the only detail she refused to change. They had offered her an elegant chef's jacket, but she refused it. If she was going to cook, she would do it as she always had. "Grandma, you're going to be amazing," Caleb said, hugging her tightly. Clara took her hand. "Don't forget about us." Miss Beatrice laughed softly and kissed both their foreheads. "I would never, my children." She got into the car, feeling her heart pound. As the vehicle moved through the city streets, Miss Beatrice watched out the window as the small, colorful buildings of her neighborhood transformed into enormous structures of glass and steel. It was another world. When they arrived at the mansion where the event was being held, misplaned, Beatrice had to stifle a gasp of amazement. The house was huge, with a white facade illuminated by elegant lights. The garden was perfectly manicured, with tables decorated with silk tablecloths and centerpieces with flowers that probably cost more than her month's rent. Mr. Sterling was waiting for her at the entrance with a glass of wine in his hand. "Welcome, Miss Beatrice." She got out of the car cautiously, feeling all eyes on her. Some guests looked at her with curiosity, others with contempt. "Who is she?" murmured a woman in a shiny dress. "She doesn't look like a professional chef." Miss Beatrice took a deep breath. She wasn't going to let them intimidate her. "Where is the kitchen?" she asked with a firmness that surprised Mr. Sterling. He smiled slightly and pointed her in the direction. "This way." The kitchen was bigger than her entire apartment. The stoves were stainless steel, the pots gleamed under the white ceiling light, and a team of kitchen helpers awaited instructions. Miss Beatrice felt a little dizzy. She wasn't used to cooking with so many people around. A woman in a white uniform with her hair tied in a neat bun approached her. "Do you need anything, ma'am?" "Miss." Beatrice looked at her and nodded slowly. "Yes, I need time." She took a moment to walk around the kitchen, touching the pots, feeling the texture of the ingredients. No matter how big or luxurious the place was, the kitchen was always her refuge. She closed her eyes and remembered her mother's words. "No matter where you are, all you need is love and fire to cook." She smiled and started to work. The aromas of the Brunswick stew soon filled the kitchen. The simmering vegetables, the rich broth, the spices mixing in the pot. It was an aroma that not only filled the space but also awakened memories. The kitchen helpers stopped moving for a moment, surprised by the depth of the smell. Even Mr. Sterling, who had come in to supervise, closed his eyes for an instant, breathing deeply. "Incredible," he whispered. But not everyone was impressed. In a corner of the kitchen, a young, arrogant chef watched with disdain. "Market food," he murmured with a mocking smile to a colleague. Miss Beatrice heard the comment, but chose to ignore it. She knew the flavor of her stew would speak for itself. When it was time to serve, Miss Beatrice came out of the kitchen with her dish in hand. The conversations at the event gradually died down as the aroma of the Brunswick stew reached the tables. The guests looked at the dish skeptically. "Stew," said a man with a mocking tone. "I thought we would have something more refined tonight." Miss Beatrice didn't respond, just watched as Mr. Sterling took the first bite. The silence grew deeper. Mr. Sterling's eyes darkened for a moment, and then, in a firm voice, he said, "This is the best stew I have ever tasted in my life." The guests looked at each other in surprise. One by one, they began to taste the dish. Their expressions changed. Some closed their eyes, others sighed. It wasn't just a dish, it was a memory, a trip to the past, a mother's hug in every bite. One by one, they began to taste the dish. Their expressions changed. Some closed their eyes, others sighed. It wasn't just a dish, it was a memory, a trip to the past, a mother's hug in every bite. But as Miss Beatrice watched the diner's reactions, she felt a hostile gaze from across the room. She looked up and, in the crowd, saw a familiar figure. It was Miss Sharon. Using connections she had cultivated over years of market politics, she had managed to secure an invitation. Now she stood with her arms crossed, her eyes full of hatred. Miss Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. She knew her rival wasn't going to leave her in peace. Miss Beatrice felt the weight of Miss Sharon's gaze from the other side of the room. She knew it was no coincidence that she was there. They hadn't seen each other since the day she was expelled from the market, since they took away her food stall and humiliated her in front of everyone. And now, as the richest people in the city tasted her stew with astonishment and admiration, Miss Sharon stood with her arms crossed and her lips pressed into a thin line. Caleb noticed the tension on his grandmother's face and approached her, gently pulling on her apron. "Grandma, what is Miss Sharon doing here?" Miss Beatrice blinked and looked away. "I don't know, my child, but nothing good." Before she could react, Mr. Sterling appeared by her side with a serious expression. "Miss Beatrice, can we talk?" She nodded slowly and followed him to one of the mansion's terraces. The night air was cool, and the city lights twinkled on the horizon. Mr. Sterling placed his hands on the railing and took a deep breath before turning to her. "Your stew took me to a place I hadn't remembered in a long time." Miss Beatrice frowned. "What do you mean?" "My childhood." There was a heavy silence. "My mother used to make me a stew like this. I last tasted it when I was 8 years old, before she died." Miss Beatrice looked down. "I'm sorry. I don't want pity, ma'am," Mr. Sterling said with a bitter smile. "I want you to work with me, miss." Beatrice's head shot up. "Work with you? I want to open a restaurant in downtown Atlanta, and I want you to be the head chef." Miss Beatrice's heart pounded. It was a dream she had never allowed herself to have. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes." Miss Beatrice felt her mind fill with doubts. "I've never worked in a restaurant. That doesn't matter. Your food speaks for itself." "Miss." Beatrice remained silent, feeling the world spin too fast. "I need time to think." Mr. Sterling nodded. "Take your time, but know that this opportunity doesn't come twice." Before Miss Beatrice could respond, a voice interrupted the conversation. "What a surprise to see you here, Beatrice." The tone was sweet, but the venom in her words was unmistakable. Miss Beatrice turned slowly. Miss Sharon was standing on the terrace with a fake smile. "I never imagined you'd end up in a place like this." Mr. Sterling looked at her coldly. "Do we know each other?" "No, but I know you," replied Miss Sharon with a calculated smile. "And I know Miss Beatrice well." Miss Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you want, Sharon?" The woman took a step forward. "I just came to warn you, dear. Don't get used to this life, because when you least expect it, you'll be back on the ground you came from." Rage burned in Miss Beatrice's chest. "You have no right to be here." "Oh, but I do," said Miss Sharon with a soft laugh. "I have friends everywhere." She looked at Mr. Sterling with feigned interest. It would be a shame if an investment like yours ended badly for trusting the wrong person. Mr. Sterling didn't look away from her. I don't like to waste my time with threats. Miss Sharon raised her hands in a gesture of innocence. It's not a threat, just some advice. She turned to Miss Beatrice. We'll see each other soon. And with that, she disappeared among the guests. Miss Beatrice felt her body tremble with fury. Mr. Sterling watched her in silence before speaking. Is she your enemy? She's more than that, whispered Miss Beatrice. She's a ghost from my past. Mr. Sterling crossed his arms. Then we'd better face it head on. Miss Beatrice looked at him with uncertainty. What do you mean? That if you accept my proposal, Miss Sharon won't be able to do anything to you. This was the moment her entire life could pivot. On one hand, a dream she never dared to have. On the other, a war against a relentless enemy. Accepting his offer wasn't just about opening a restaurant, it was about stepping into a battle she had to win. Miss Beatrice swallowed hard. She knew that if she accepted, her life would change forever. But she also knew that if she didn't, Miss Sharon would keep her promise and bring her down. Miss Beatrice spent a sleepless night. Mr. Sterling's proposal echoed in her mind over and over. She couldn't deny that the idea of having her own restaurant was tempting. To go from selling food on the street to running a kitchen in downtown Atlanta was a dream she had never allowed herself to imagine. But she also knew that accepting meant entering a world completely unknown to her, a world where not everyone would accept her. Even more, there was Miss Sharon. Her warning had not been in vain. If she had managed to get her kicked out of the market, she would undoubtedly do the impossible to prevent her from growing even more. The dawn found her sitting at the small table in her home, her hands clasped and her eyes fixed on an indefinite point. Caleb and Clara woke up shortly after and found her in the same position. "Grandma?" Clara asked in a sleepy voice. Caleb rubbed his eyes and approached her. "You haven't slept, have you, miss?" Beatrice smiled weakly. "Not much, my child." Caleb sat in front of her and looked at her intently. "Is it about the restaurant?" Miss Beatrice nodded. "I don't know if it's the right thing to do, Caleb." The boy frowned. "Why not?" "It's what you've always dreamed of." "I don't know how to run a restaurant. I've never done anything like this." Caleb looked at her with determination. "You also didn't know how you were going to get by when they took your stall at the market, and here we are." Miss Beatrice looked down. "And what if I fail?" Caleb took her hand tightly. "Then we'll try again." Miss Beatrice felt a lump in her throat. Her grandson believed in her more than she believed in herself. Clara hugged her arm and looked at her with eyes full of tenderness. "I want you to cook like before, Grandma." It was then that she knew she had no other choice. She couldn't continue living in fear. She couldn't pass up the opportunity to change their lives. She took a deep breath and stood up. "All right, I'll do it." Caleb and Clara jumped with excitement. "I knew you would!" exclaimed Caleb. "Yay!" shouted Clara, hugging her grandmother tightly. "But Miss..." Beatrice knew that saying yes was only the first step. Now came the hardest part. Hours later, Miss Beatrice stood before Mr. Sterling in a cafe in downtown Atlanta. The businessman watched her with a slight smile as he stirred his coffee. "I knew you would make the right decision." Miss Beatrice sighed. "I just want to make something clear, Mr. Sterling. I don't want luxuries or extravagant things. I just want to cook as I've always done." Mr. Sterling nodded. "That's exactly what I want. Your food doesn't need frills. It needs to reach people." Miss Beatrice looked at him curiously. "Why are you doing this?" Mr. Sterling placed the spoon on the saucer and watched her intently. "Because your food reminded me of something I thought I had lost." Miss Beatrice felt there was something more behind his words but didn't press. "What do I have to do?" Mr. Sterling smiled. "We already have a location. It's in a busy area, but it needs renovations." I'll introduce you to a team that will help you set it up." Miss Beatrice nodded slowly. "And the money?" "I'll take care of the initial investment. You just have to take care of the kitchen." The words left her speechless. "That's a lot of money. I'm confident we'll make it back very soon." Miss Beatrice felt overwhelmed for a moment but took a deep breath. "All right, I'll do it." Mr. Sterling extended his hand. "Welcome to your new life, Miss Beatrice." She shook his hand firmly, but as she did, she felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't help but think that accepting this deal also meant accepting a destiny she didn't fully understand. And what she didn't know was that this restaurant would not only change her life, but also reveal secrets from the past she never imagined. Miss Beatrice walked slowly through the space in downtown Atlanta that Mr. Sterling had secured for the restaurant. It was larger than she had imagined. The high ceiling, the old stone walls, and the large windows overlooking the square gave it an elegant yet cozy feel. However, it was still empty, cold. Around her, architects and designers took notes, measuring the space and making calculations. Soon that place would be full of tables, aromas, and life. "It's a good space, don't you think?" said Mr. Sterling, standing beside her with a serene expression. Miss Beatrice nodded, although inside she felt a slight knot in her stomach. "Yes, but I've never worked in a place like this." Mr. Sterling smiled patiently. "That's why you'll have a team to help you. You won't be alone." "Miss." Beatrice looked at Caleb and Clara, who were running around the place, imagining where everything would be. "I just want to do things right," she whispered. Mr. Sterling looked at her firmly. "There's no doubt you will. But I must warn you about something." Miss Beatrice looked at him with a frown. "This won't be easy. You've already seen that there are people who don't want you to succeed." Miss Beatrice clenched her hands. "Are you talking about Miss Sharon?" Mr. Sterling nodded slowly. "Her and others. You'll be entering a world where many will believe you don't deserve to be here." Miss Beatrice already knew. She had seen it in the eyes of the chefs at the food festival, felt it in the words of contempt in Buckhead, but she wasn't afraid. "I won't let them take what's mine again," she said with determination. Mr. Sterling smiled. "That's what I wanted to hear." The following weeks were a whirlwind. The restaurant's renovation progressed quickly. Every day, the place took more shape. The walls were painted with warm colors, dim light fixtures were installed, and the tables were chosen with a rustic design reminiscent of traditional Southern homes. But the kitchen that was the jewel of the restaurant, a spacious area with modern stoves, but without losing traditional elements. There were cast-iron skillets, copper pots, and a large stone mill for making fresh cornbread batter. It was a perfect balance between the new and the old. When Miss Beatrice saw the final result, she felt a lump in her throat. It was more than she had dreamed. Caleb and Clara ran to hug her. "Grandma, it's almost ready." Miss Beatrice smiled, running her hands over one of the wooden tables. "Yes, my child, almost." But the most important thing was still missing. The kitchen team. On the day of the interviews, Miss Beatrice arrived early at the restaurant, ready to meet her team. "Ready, mister?" Sterling asked, drinking a coffee. "Ready," she replied, although in reality she wasn't so sure. One by one, the candidates entered the restaurant. There were enthusiastic young people, experienced chefs, and people who, like her, came from cooking on the streets and in markets. But there was one in particular who caught her attention. Zane, a young man no more than 30, tall with dark hair and a defiant look. When he entered the kitchen, he barely looked Miss Beatrice in the eyes. "Good morning," he said in a neutral voice. Miss Beatrice crossed her arms. "Why do you want to work here?" Zane smiled smugly. "Because I want to learn." Miss Beatrice was not intimidated. Food is not just learned in a school. It's learned with the soul. Zane didn't respond. All right, I'll hire you. But I want respect in my kitchen. That won't be a problem, Zane said with an almost mocking smile. When he left the office, Miss Beatrice sighed. Mr. Sterling looked at her with curiosity. Are you sure about hiring him? I prefer to keep those I don't trust close, she replied calmly. That way, I can watch them better. Mr. Sterling let out a slight chuckle. I like the way you think. But as Miss Beatrice reviewed the list of her new team, she felt a strange sensation in her chest. Zane wasn't there just to learn, and sooner or later, she would discover his true intentions. Miss Beatrice's restaurant opened its doors on a temperate morning in downtown Atlanta. The day she had imagined so much had finally arrived. The facade had a warm and traditional design with a simple yet elegant sign that read Beatrice's Kitchen. There was nothing pretentious about it because the food would speak for itself. From early on, Miss Beatrice was in the kitchen, checking every detail with the same patience and dedication she had when she sold at the market. The difference was that now she had a team, and therein lay the problem. Zane, the young chef with his always haughty attitude, seemed to watch everything with a mixture of indifference and disdain. He had accepted the job, but Miss Beatrice knew he didn't do it because he respected her. There was something else behind his presence, and sooner or later she would find out what it was. We're going to have important clients today, announced Mr. Sterling as he checked some reservations. Politicians, businessmen, and a couple of food critics. Miss Beatrice nodded. She wasn't worried about the names or titles of her clients. Everyone was going to eat the same thing, regardless of their status. The first customers began to arrive at noon. Couples, families, curious tourists who passed by on the street and were drawn in by the aroma coming from the kitchen. The Brunswick stew was the first dish to run out. But then, something unexpected happened. A man in an expensive suit stood up abruptly from his table and clutched his stomach. I feel sick, he exclaimed, his face pale. Something in the food. The murmur in the restaurant was immediate. Some customers put down their cutlery and watched the scene with concern. Another diner, a woman in her 50s, also put a hand to her mouth. I think the food didn't agree with me, Miss. Beatrice came out of the kitchen upon hearing the commotion. She felt a chill run down her spine. What's going on? She asked in a firm voice. One of the waiters approached her nervously. Some customers say the food made them sick. Mr. Sterling stood up, his face serious. That's not possible. Miss? Beatrice felt her heart pound. She knew perfectly well that every ingredient had been checked, that every dish had been prepared with the same care as always. It was then that she noticed something on the table where the customers were complaining. The plates were barely touched, the stew almost intact. Miss Beatrice's eyes narrowed. This was no accident. She took a deep breath and calmly approached the table. Sir, I'm sorry you're feeling this way, but if you barely tasted the food, how is it possible that it made you sick so quickly? The man looked at her with a mixture of surprise and annoyance. Are you calling me a liar? The woman who had also complained pursed her lips. We just want you to check the food. Miss Beatrice nodded. We'll do that. She turned to one of her kitchen assistants. Bring me samples of the dishes that were served. The murmur in the restaurant grew. Some customers looked on with suspicion. Others seemed to be waiting for a show. When the samples arrived, Miss Beatrice took a spoon and tasted the stew directly in front of everyone. The silence was absolute. She took a few seconds, savoring the dish carefully. Then she looked up. The food is perfectly fine. The confidence in her tone made some customers relax, but the man in the suit continued his charade. This is a scandal. I'm going to have this place shut down. It was then that Miss Sterling intervened. What's your name, sir? The man seemed to hesitate. That's not important. Mr. Sterling took out his phone. I think it is. Because if you really have food poisoning, you should go to the hospital. And if you're lying, you should know that we have cameras in the kitchen that record every movement." The man's face changed. He no longer looked sick. Now he looked trapped. Without another word, he left some dollar bills on the table and hurriedly left the restaurant. The woman who accompanied him followed in silence. In the kitchen, Zane watched everything from the doorway with a half-smile on his face. Miss Beatrice crossed her arms. She understood at that moment. "It was Miss Sharon," she whispered. Mr. Sterling nodded. "And this is just the beginning." Miss Beatrice felt a mixture of fury and determination. If they thought they could scare her with these tricks, they were mistaken. But what she didn't know was that Miss Sharon had more cards up her sleeve and was willing to use them all. Night had fallen over Atlanta when the restaurant closed its doors after the most difficult day since its opening. Miss Beatrice was exhausted. The sabotage attempt had not gone as Miss Sharon had hoped, but it had cast a shadow over her success. Rumors about the sick customers had spread quickly. Some reservations were canceled, and although many customers continued to arrive, distrust was in the air. But Miss Beatrice would not give up. "Tomorrow is another day," she muttered to herself as she cleaned one of the tables, although her body craved rest. Caleb and Clara, who had stayed in the kitchen helping to clean up, came out to see her. "Grandma, do you really think Miss Sharon is going to stop?" Caleb asked with a frown. Miss Beatrice sighed, leaving the cloth on the table. "No, my child. She's not going to stop." Clara, hugging her doll, looked at her with concern. "And what if she tells more lies? Then we will tell the truth louder," replied Miss Beatrice firmly. "I am not going to let her take away what I have built again." The restaurant door burst open, interrupting the conversation. Mr. Sterling entered with quick steps, followed by a man no one expected to see. Tall, with dark hair with some gray at the temples, dressed in an expensive but not ostentatious suit, his eyes had a strange weight, as if they saw beyond the obvious. "Beatrice, Mr. Sterling said in a serious tone, "this man wants to talk to you." Miss Beatrice looked at the stranger cautiously. "Good evening." The man nodded slightly. "Good evening, ma'am. My name is Mr. Hayes." Miss Beatrice waited, but he didn't continue. Caleb approached, unable to contain his curiosity. "Are you a customer?" Martin smiled sideways. "Something like that." "Miss." Beatrice crossed her arms. "If you want to try my food, I'm sorry, but the kitchen is already closed." Martin shook his head. "I didn't come to dine. I came to make you an offer." Silence fell over the place. Mr. Sterling narrowed his eyes. "What kind of offer?" Martin slid a card across the table. "I represent a group of investors who are looking to expand traditional Southern gastronomy into new markets." Miss Ise. Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. "What does that mean? We want to buy your restaurant." Caleb let out a choked exclamation. "What? Miss?" Beatrice blinked, feeling the ground move beneath her feet. "There must be a mistake. This restaurant hasn't even been open for a month." Martin smiled. "Precisely. It has a powerful story, a chef with authentic roots, and a concept that can grow." Miss Beatrice felt her stomach lurch. "I'm not interested in selling." Martin didn't seem surprised by her response. "We will offer you a figure you can't refuse." Mr. Sterling stepped forward with a frown. "If you think you can come in here and buy something that is just beginning," Martin raised a hand, interrupting him. "This is not a hostile takeover, Mr. Sterling. It's an opportunity. We are not asking for an immediate answer. But think about it. What today is a modest kitchen in downtown Atlanta could become a chain of restaurants." Miss Beatrice pressed her lips together. "If you're looking to expand Southern gastronomy, there are many other places." "Why my restaurant?" Martin looked at her intently. "Because your story sells." Miss Beatrice felt a chill down her spine. They weren't talking about her food, but about her. "I don't want my story to be sold as a product," she said firmly. Martin held her gaze for a long moment. "I understand, but opportunities don't always wait." He left his card on the table and turned to Mr. Sterling. "We'll talk again." And with that, he left the restaurant. The silence lingered in the air. Caleb was the first to break it. "What was that?" "Miss." Beatrice took the card and looked at it with a frown. It was a reminder. Mr. Sterling crossed his arms. "That this restaurant is no longer just a business. It's a symbol, miss." Beatrice looked at him seriously. "Is that good or bad? It depends on who wants to use it to their advantage." Miss Beatrice took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation. First Miss Prosson, Sharon, now unknown investors. Not even 30 days had passed since the restaurant opened, and they were already trying to take it from her. The restaurant had survived its first major attack, but Miss Beatrice knew the storm was just beginning. The false accusations of food poisoning, the investor's offer, and Miss Sharon's presence in her life again made her feel like she was in a constant battle. But the most dangerous threat wasn't coming from the outside, but from within. Because inside her kitchen, there was a rift that grew every day. Zane. From the first moment, Miss Beatrice had felt that the young chef wasn't there for the right reasons. He didn't lack talent, but his attitude said it all. He didn't respect her, and that night, in the middle of a work shift, it became clearer than ever. "This makes no sense," Zane muttered as he reviewed the menu. "If you want this place to survive, you have to innovate." Miss Beatrice, who was finishing seasoning a stew, glanced at him. "Innovate? How?" Zane shrugged with an arrogant smile. "Look around you. All the modern restaurants are doing fusions, new techniques, ingredients from other countries. We can't keep cooking as if we're at a market." The sound of knives on cutting boards stopped. The other cooks, who had been silent until then, raised their heads. Miss Beatrice left the wooden spoon on the pot and wiped her hands on her apron. "Do you have a problem with markets?" Zane let out a short laugh. "It's not personal, but I do think we need to evolve." Miss Beatrice walked slowly until she was in front of him. "Tell me something, Zane. Have you ever eaten at a market?" The young man frowned, uncomfortable with the question. "Yes, of course. And have you ever seen a mother feeding her child with the last dollar she had? Have you seen an old man close his eyes when tasting a bite because it reminded him of his youth?" Zane didn't answer. Cooking is not a trend. It's not a trick to impress people with complicated names or colorful foams. Cooking is history. It's identity. It's home. Zane held her gaze for a few seconds and then smiled ironically. "That's very nice, but people with money want something else. We don't serve food for people with money here. We serve food for people who want to remember." The silence in the kitchen was heavy. One of the waiters entered hurriedly, breaking the tension. "Miss Beatrice, there's a customer who wants to talk to you." Miss Beatrice sighed and turned to her team. "Continue with the orders." When she went out to the dining room, she found an elegantly dressed man with graying hair and a watch that probably cost more than the entire restaurant. "Good evening," she said politely. The man looked at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "You're the owner of this place, right?" "Yes, sir. Is there a problem with the food?" The man took his napkin and folded it precisely. "No, on the contrary. The stew was excellent." Miss Beatrice waited. "But I must tell you something. I think you could charge more for your menu." Miss Beatrice blinked, surprised. "Charge more? This restaurant has potential. With your story, your flavor, and the concept you've created, you could attract a much more exclusive clientele." Miss Beatrice felt a chill down her spine. "I don't want my food to be a luxury. The man smiled slightly. Then you're wasting a great opportunity. He stood up, left a couple of bills on the table, and left. Miss Beatrice looked at the money without touching it. Was he right? Should she raise the prices? But then she remembered Caleb and Clara eating happily at the table in their apartment. She remembered the humble people from the market, those who had supported her in the worst moments, and she knew she couldn't change who she was just for money. But as she returned to the kitchen, she knew that Zane thought differently, and that sooner or later, that clash between them would turn into a real war. Caleb couldn't get Mr. Sterling's words out of his head. This restaurant is no longer just a business. It's a symbol. There was something in the way the businessman spoke, in the way he looked at his grandmother when he first tasted her food, as if he had known her from before. So, he decided to find out more. Taking advantage of the fact that Mr. Sterling had left early that night, Caleb slipped into his office on the second floor of the restaurant. He knew it wasn't right to snoop, but something told him there were secrets in that room. He turned on the desk lamp and began to look through the papers on the table. Most were documents about suppliers and restaurant accounts, but at the back of a drawer, he found something that made his blood run cold. An old photograph, yellowed with time. In it, there was a young woman in a kitchen apron, smiling at the camera while holding a cast-iron Dutch oven. It wasn't Miss Beatrice, but she looked a lot like her. Caleb took a step back. It was his great-grandmother. He turned sharply when he heard footsteps on the stairs. "What are you doing here, boy?" "Mr." Sterling's voice echoed in the office. Caleb hid the photo in his pocket before turning slowly. "I was just looking for something." Mr. Sterling looked at him with suspicion, but said nothing. "You shouldn't be in here without permission." Caleb pressed his lips together. "Who was she?" The businessman frowned. "Who?" Caleb took out the photo and held it in front of him. "This woman. She's my great-grandmother, isn't she?" For the first time since he'd met him, Mr. Sterling seemed surprised. "Where did you find this?" "In your desk." "Why do you have it?" The silence between them became heavy. "We'd better talk downstairs," Mr. Sterling finally said. Caleb followed him to the restaurant's empty dining room. He knew he was about to discover something important. "Mr." Sterling poured himself some coffee and stared at the cup for a few seconds before speaking. "Many years ago, your great-grandmother worked in the kitchen of a wealthy family in Savannah. She wasn't just a cook. She was one of the best I've ever known." Caleb listened intently. "My mother worked in that house," Mr. Sterling continued. "I was just a boy, but I remember the aroma of her stew. It was the same as your grandmother's." Caleb felt his heart beat faster. "So, you knew my family from before?" Mr. Sterling nodded slowly. "Your great-grandmother fed me many times when I was a child, but one day she disappeared." "Disappeared?" "She left the house without saying anything. I never knew why." Caleb swallowed. His grandmother had never talked about that. "Why did you never tell her this?" Mr. Sterling sighed. "Because I didn't know if I should. But now that you're here asking, I think it's time for your grandmother to know the truth." Caleb looked at the photo in his hands. His great-grandmother and Mr. Sterling were connected by more than just food. And he had a feeling that this secret could change everything. Caleb remained silent after hearing Mr. Sterling's story. He had discovered that his great-grandmother had worked in the house where Mr. Sterling grew up, but many questions remained. Why had she left without saying anything? Why had Mr. Sterling never told Miss Beatrice this? But before he could ask further, "Mr." Sterling placed a hand on his shoulder. "Son, some things are best revealed at the right time." Caleb pressed his lips together. "But my grandma deserves to know the truth. And she will. But not now." Caleb disagreed, but knew he wouldn't get any more information at that moment. He put the photo in his pocket and left the office, his mind full of thoughts. He didn't imagine that while he was discovering secrets from the past, someone else was already planning an attack on the restaurant. Miss Beatrice woke up that morning with a bad feeling. She had spent the last few days trying to win back customers after the incident with the fake customers and Miss Sharon's lies. The rumors of food poisoning continued to affect the business, and although loyal customers were returning, uncertainty lingered in the air. She got out of bed, went to the kitchen, and poured some coffee into a clay mug. The silence of the apartment building was absolute. Only the wind blowing through the cracks in the doors and windows could be heard. But then, a distant noise made her skin crawl. Sirens, then screams. She quickly left her house and saw an orange glow illuminating the sky. The fire. No, it can't be. The restaurant. Miss Beatrice began to run with all her might through the dark streets, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. It couldn't be true. When she arrived in downtown Atlanta, the scene was worse than she had imagined. The flames were devouring the back of the restaurant. Black smoke rose to the sky, and people were crowding around, watching the disaster. "Caleb! Grandma!" The boy ran to her, his face covered in soot, and his eyes full of tears. "They called us from a neighbor's house. They said there was a fire." Miss Beatrice felt her legs tremble. "And Clara?" "She's with Miss Joyce." "Mr. Sterling arrived in his car and got out quickly. I called the fire department as soon as I was notified. The flames continued to consume the back of the restaurant. The firefighters worked to contain the fire, but the damage was already done." Miss Beatrice felt tears burn her eyes. Everything she had fought for was now engulfed in flames. One of the officers approached her. "Ma'am, I'm very sorry, but we need you to stay back." "How did this happen?" Mr. Sterling asked with a frown. The firefighter sighed. "We're still investigating, but everything indicates that the fire was intentional." Caleb clenched his fists. "It was Miss Sharon. I'm sure of it." Miss Beatrice closed her eyes for a moment. It was the most likely scenario. But then a thought crossed her mind. Zane. She had hired him because she knew he wasn't trustworthy, because she preferred to keep her enemies close. And now her restaurant was in flames. She turned slowly and saw Zane standing in the crowd, his arms crossed and an unreadable expression on his face. "Zane," she said in a tense voice, "do you know anything about this?" The young chef looked at her without blinking. "Do you think it was me?" Miss Beatrice didn't answer. "I have no reason to burn my own job," Zane added coldly. Caleb looked at him with rage. "But you do have reasons to destroy my grandma's dream." Zane was unfazed. "I'm just saying that maybe your real enemy is closer than you think." Miss Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. She knew Miss Beatrice. Sharon was behind many of the restaurant's problems, but something in Zane's words made her doubt. If it hadn't been him, who had started the fire? Just when she thought she had found solid ground, the floor was set on fire beneath her feet. The attack was a devastating blow, but the question of who was truly behind it cast an even darker shadow. The enemy you know is one thing, but the one you don't see coming is often the most dangerous of all. The smell of smoke still clung to Miss Beatrice's clothes when she returned to the restaurant the next morning. The flames were out, but the damage was done. The back of the restaurant was destroyed. The storage room where they kept ingredients, the secondary stoves, and some furniture were reduced to ashes. They had lost a significant amount of supplies, but the worst was the emotional blow. The firefighters had confirmed that the fire was arson. Someone had done it on purpose. Miss Beatrice stood in front of the rubble, arms crossed, and a frown on her face. She wasn't going to let this break her. Caleb and Clara arrived shortly after, along with Mr. Sterling, who was on the phone with his lawyer. "We've already filed a report," he said as he hung up. "But you know this is going to be complicated." Miss Beatrice didn't take her eyes off the ruins. Complicated? She whispered. No, Arthur. This is war. Caleb clenched his fists. There has to be a way to prove it was Miss Sharon. Miss Beatrice sighed and ran a hand over her face. We need proof. It was then that a murmur in the street caught her attention. A few feet from the restaurant, a familiar figure watched everything with a satisfied smile. Miss Sharon, dressed in her characteristic dark cardigan, was leaning against a post, arms crossed and eyes shining with mockery. Miss Beatrice felt her blood boil. I'm going to talk to her. Mr. Sterling put a hand on her arm. Beatrice, no. She won't say anything useful. I don't need her to say anything. I just want to look her in the eyes. She approached with a firm stride as Miss Sharon straightened up. Well, Beatrice, what a great tragedy. Miss Beatrice remained calm. Did you come to admire your work? Miss Sharon placed a hand on her chest, feigning indignation. How can you say that? I was just passing by and came across this terrible news. Miss Beatrice gritted her teeth. Don't you dare play games with me, Sharon. I know it was you. Miss Sharon tilted her head and smiled. I didn't do anything, Beatrice. But what a shame, right? Just when you were achieving something, it all comes crashing down. Miss Beatrice felt a chill. She knew Miss Sharon was behind everything, but the lack of proof made her even more dangerous. Listen to me carefully, Sharon, she whispered, getting closer. No matter how many times you try to bring me down, I will always get back up. Miss Sharon looked at her mockingly. We'll see. She turned and walked away slowly, leaving behind the smell of ash and smoke. Caleb ran to his grandmother. We have to do something. Miss Beatrice took a deep breath. We will, my child. But in our own way. She turned to Mr. Sterling. I'm going to rebuild this restaurant, and I'll make it stronger than before. Mr. Sterling smiled in approval. Then let's start today. But as Miss Beatrice planned to rise from the ashes, Miss Sharon prepared her next attack. Because for her, this had only just begun. The smell of ashes still permeated the air when Miss Beatrice walked through the restaurant door that morning. The fire had been extinguished, but the flames still burned within her. The damage was severe. The back storage room was reduced to rubble, and several parts of the kitchen had suffered heat damage. But the most worrying thing was not the material loss, it was the message this fire brought with it. Miss Beatrice looked around, her gaze scanning what was left of her restaurant. Caleb and Clara watched her silently from the entrance. Mr. Sterling was talking to some workers who had already begun to assess the reconstruction. But there was someone else in the kitchen. Zane, the young chef, was standing by one of the intact stoves, arms crossed, observing everything with a disturbing calm. What a tragedy, right? He said with a lopsided smile, when Mrs. reconciled. Beatrice approached. She looked at him intently. If you have something to say it now. Zane raised his hands in a gesture of innocence. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that this puts a lot of things into perspective. Miss Beatrice raised an eyebrow. What are you referring to? Zane paused before answering, as if enjoying playing with his words. That you have to be smart in business. The weak always end up falling. Miss Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. You think so? I know so. And you know it too. Zane took a step forward, looking at her intently. Right now, your restaurant is in crisis. People are talking about the fire, about the food poisoning rumors, about whether you really have what it takes to be here. Miss Beatrice said nothing. She knew Zane was right about one thing. The rumors were spreading like wildfire. Listen to me carefully, he continued, leaning slightly towards her. You have two options. You can keep trying to save this place the old-fashioned way, clinging to recipes that, although good, won't take you any further than you've already come. And the other option, Miss? Beatrice asked in a firm voice. Zane smiled. Let me run the kitchen, renovate the menu, Change the concept. Turn this into a real restaurant. A modern one, with dishes that will truly attract the new clientele. Miss Beatrice felt her blood boil. So that's what you really want. What I want is for this restaurant to survive, Zane replied coldly. And with my help, we can make it grow. Miss Beatrice looked him in the eyes, trying to decipher how far his true intentions went. And if I say no? Zane sighed and smiled sideways. Then you'll watch it fall on your own. The silence between them grew dense. Miss Beatrice took a deep breath without looking away. If you think I'm going to change my food just so rich people can talk about me, you are very mistaken. Zane narrowed his eyes. We'll see. He turned and left the kitchen, leaving an air of defiance behind him. Caleb, who had been watching from the door, ran to his grandmother. Grandma, you can't trust him. Miss Beatrice ran a hand through his hair tenderly. I know, my child. I know. But what neither of them imagined was that Zane was not willing to wait to get his way. That same night, when the restaurant was empty and the reconstruction had just begun, someone entered the kitchen and began to make changes to the recipes without anyone noticing. When Miss Beatrice tasted the food the next day, she would discover that something was very, very wrong. The restaurant was still in recovery after the fire, but Miss Beatrice had no time for regrets. She knew that if she stopped, Miss Sharon would win, and she wasn't going to let that happen. The reconstruction was moving quickly, thanks to Mr. Sterling, who had hired workers day and night to repair the damage. However, mist and calm, Beatrice was worried about something else. Zane's intentions. After his strange comment the night before, Miss Beatrice had paid more attention to him. She knew that boy wasn't there just to learn. But before confronting him, there was something more urgent to resolve. Caleb had information she needed to know. Since the fire, the boy had been quieter than usual. Something was bothering him, until finally, one afternoon while they were in the apartment, he decided to speak. Grandma, I have to tell you something. Miss Beatrice put down the knife she was using to chop vegetables and looked at him attentively. Tell me, my child. Caleb hesitated for a second, but then he took a crumpled photograph from his pocket and placed it on the table. Mr. Sterling knew my great-grandmother. Miss Beatrice frowned and carefully took the photo. It was her mother, young in a white apron, with a large cast-iron Dutch oven in her hands and a calm smile. Where did you get this? In Mr. Sterling's office. Miss. Beatrice felt a chill. Did he give it to you? Caleb shook his head. No, I found it. And when I asked him, he told me that my great-grandmother worked for his family when he was a child. Miss Beatrice was silent. She had never heard that story. Her mother never talked about the past. He says she disappeared from the house without saying anything. Miss Beatrice's heart pounded. And why did he never tell me? Because he says he didn't know if he should. Caleb looked at her uncertainly. Grandma, do you think Mr. Sterling is hiding something from us? Miss Beatrice didn't answer immediately. She knew that Mr. Sterling had been generous to her. He had financed her restaurant, supported her when no one else did. But now there was a shadow of doubt in her mind. She stood up decisively. I'm going to talk to him. That night, Miss Beatrice arrived at the restaurant as the workers were finishing their shift. She found Mr. Sterling in his office, reviewing documents. When he saw her, he smiled kindly. Beatrice, come in. She closed the door behind her and sat down in front of him. Arthur, I need you to tell me the truth. The man put the papers aside and frowned. About what? Miss Beatrice placed the photo on the desk. About my mother. For the first time, Mr. Sterling seemed nervous. Caleb showed it to you. Yes. And now I want to know everything. Mr. Sterling sighed and rubbed his temples. Beatrice, there are things from the past that are better left undisturbed. You don't get to decide that. Mr. Sterling looked at her in silence. He knew he couldn't keep hiding it. Your mother worked for my family when I was a child. She was the cook in my house. I know that already, Mr. Sterling swallowed. But what you don't know is why she left. Miss Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. Tell me. Mr. Sterling got up and walked to the window. My father was not a good man. Miss Beatrice clenched her fists. What did he do to my mother? Mr. Sterling turned slowly. I don't know exactly. I just know that one night she fled the house and I never saw her again. Miss Beatrice felt her breath catch. She fled? Yes. And my mother never wanted to talk about it. Miss Beatrice felt a mix of emotions. If her mother had escaped from that place, it was because something terrible had happened. Why did you never tell me? Mr. Sterling looked at her sincerely. Because I didn't want you to think I helped you out of pity. And did you? No, he replied without hesitation. I helped you because when I tasted your food, I knew it was the same from my childhood. And because I felt I owed a debt to your family. Miss Beatrice felt a lump in her throat. She didn't know if she should believe him, but there was something else that troubled her. Who was your father, Arthur? The businessman's face hardened. A man best forgotten. Miss Beatrice didn't insist, but she knew at that moment that her story with Mr. Sterling was no coincidence, and that if she wanted to discover the truth, she would have to look for more answers on her own. The atmosphere in the restaurant had grown tense after the fire and reconstruction. Nothing felt the same again. Customer confidence was still recovering, and inside the kitchen, the conflicts between Miss Beatrice and Zane became more evident. But what Miss Beatrice didn't know was that her biggest blow was yet to come. It was a quiet afternoon when the police arrived at the restaurant. 2 uniformed officers entered with firm steps, their cold gazes scanning the place until they found her. Beatrice Martin? Miss Beatrice, who was checking a delivery of ingredients, looked up. Yes, that's me. The officer pulled a document from his folder and extended it. You are under arrest for fraud and embezzlement. Silence took over the restaurant. Customers stopped eating. Waiters stood paralyzed. What? What are you saying? Miss Beatrice felt her heart pound. We have received a complaint against you, the officer continued. You are accused of diverting money from this restaurant's investment for personal use. Miss Beatrice felt a chill. That's a lie. You will have the opportunity to prove it, but for now, you will have to come with us to the station. Caleb appeared from between the tables and ran to his grandmother. You can't take my grandma. She didn't do anything. One of the officers knelt and placed a hand on his shoulder. Easy, son. We just want to ask some questions. Mr. Sterling rushed in from the office. Wait, this must be a mistake. The officer shook his head. We're just following protocol, Mr. Sterling. If you want to help her, get a lawyer. Miss Beatrice felt a lump in her throat as she felt the handcuffs close around her wrists. It was the worst humiliation she could imagine. As they escorted her to the exit, she looked up and saw Zane at the kitchen door. He had no expression on his face, but there was satisfaction in his eyes. It was at that moment that she knew. He was behind it all. There is no deeper betrayal than being framed by someone you gave a chance to. As the handcuffs closed around her wrists, Miss Beatrice felt the crushing weight of a carefully laid trap. With her freedom and reputation stolen, her fight for survival had just become more desperate than ever. Caleb ran after the patrol car as Miss Beatrice was put inside. Grandma, don't worry, we're going to get you out of this. Miss Beatrice smiled sadly at her grandson through the window. Take care of Clara. The patrol car started, leaving a heavy silence behind. Mr. Sterling looked at Caleb with determination. We're not going to let this stand. Caleb clenched his fists. I'm going to find the truth. But what neither of them knew was that the enemy had already planned their next move. Caleb felt like his world was collapsing. He had seen with his own eyes how they took his grandmother away in a patrol car, accused of something she would never do. Clara wouldn't stop crying, clinging to her rag doll. Caleb, what's going to happen to Grandma? Caleb squeezed her hand tightly. He couldn't let Clara see his fear. We're going to get her out, no matter what. Mr. Sterling came to his side and put a hand on his shoulder. I have a lawyer working on the case. We're going to prove she's innocent. But Caleb couldn't just stand by. Something inside him told him this wasn't just a trap, but a much bigger plan. That night, when everyone was asleep, Caleb took the photo of his great-grandmother and put it in his backpack. He had to find answers. The next morning, Caleb showed up at the restaurant. He knew Zane was behind it all, and if Zane had a hand in it, Miss Sharon couldn't be far behind. But before confronting him, he needed proof. He took advantage of Zane being busy in the kitchen and went into his office. He searched through the drawers, checked papers, accounts, anything that could be useful, and then he found something that chilled his blood, a transfer receipt. A considerable amount of money sent to an unnamed account. The date coincided with the day they accused his grandmother. Caleb swallowed. This was what he needed. But before he could leave, he heard footsteps. He turned just as the door opened. It was Zane. What are you doing here, kid? Caleb clenched the paper in his pocket. Nothing. Zane narrowed his eyes. I don't like people sticking their noses where they don't belong. Caleb lifted his chin. Me neither. Zane took a step forward. Do you know what happens to those who meddle in things that don't concern them? Caleb felt a chill but didn't move. Do you know what happens to those who betray good people? The silence became heavy. Then Zane smiled. You're brave, kid. But bravery isn't always enough. Caleb quickly left the office. He knew he couldn't stay there. That afternoon, Caleb went to the police station with Mr. Sterling. The lawyer was meeting with Miss Beatrice, who remained calm despite everything. When Caleb entered, he hugged her tightly. Grandma, we're going to get you out of here. Miss Beatrice stroked his hair tenderly. I know, my child. Caleb took the paper from his pocket and placed it on the table. Look at this. The lawyer took it and read it with a frown. Where did you find this? In Zane's office. Mr. Sterling crossed his arms. So now we know who's behind this. Miss Beatrice took a deep breath. I always knew I couldn't trust him. The lawyer stood up. I'm going to present this as evidence. This changes everything. Caleb clenched his fists. We're not going to let Zane win, Miss Zane. Beatrice smiled with pride. Of course not, my child. But while they planned their defense, Zane and Miss Sharon were already preparing their next move. Caleb couldn't just stand by. He knew the police had his grandmother detained unjustly and that Zane was behind it all. But they still lacked proof to prove it. If he wanted to save Miss Beatrice, he had to uncover the whole truth. And that truth began with Mr. Sterling. Since finding the photo of his great-grandmother in the businessman's office, Caleb had felt there was something more to his relationship with his family. Now, after Mr. Sterling confessed that his mother had worked for his, the boy was sure there was something they still weren't telling him. That same night, while Mr. Sterling was talking to the lawyer, Caleb entered his office with determination. I need to know the whole truth. The man looked up from the desk and sighed. Caleb, I already told you what I knew. No, you haven't told me everything, the boy insisted. You knew my great-grandmother. You say she left without explanation, but I don't believe you. Mr. Sterling narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? Caleb took the photo from his pocket and placed it on the table. My grandma deserves to know the truth. Mr. Sterling looked at the image in silence. His expression changed. He was no longer the self-assured businessman, but someone who had just come face to face with a memory he preferred not to awaken. Your great-grandmother, he murmured. She saved my life. Caleb felt a chill. How? Mr. Sterling sighed deeply and ran a hand over his face. It was time to tell what he had kept silent for so long. My father was a powerful man, a cruel man. Caleb said nothing, just listened. When I was a child, my mother couldn't take care of me all the time. My father kept us in a big house with servants. But he was never there, and when he was, it was better that he wasn't. The boy felt a lump in his throat. Your great-grandmother worked in our kitchen. She was young, but she already knew how to cook like no one else. She would feed me when my mother couldn't. She would tell me stories while preparing the stews. Mr. Sterling closed his eyes for a moment. But one night, everything changed. Caleb swallowed. What happened? The businessman leaned on the table with his hands. My father drank a lot, and when he drank, he became dangerous. That night, he came home drunk, shouting, breaking things. I don't know what happened exactly, but when I woke up, I heard my great-grandmother arguing with him. Caleb felt his skin crawl. She was yelling at him to leave me alone, that she wasn't going to let him touch me. Mr. Sterling's eyes clouded over. That night, she fled. But before she left, she hid me. Caleb's eyes widened in surprise. She hid you? Yes. She put me in the kitchen pantry and closed the door. She told me not to come out until everything was quiet. Mr. Sterling took a deep breath. The next morning, she was gone. Caleb felt the weight of that story in his chest. And your father? The businessman looked towards the window. My mother left him shortly after. She went far away, and I never heard from him again. The boy was silent. My great-grandmother fled to save you. Mr. Sterling nodded slowly. And that's why, when I met you and found out who your grandmother was, I understood that I had to give back to her family. Caleb looked at the photo with new eyes. So, everything you've done for Grandma is out of guilt? Mr. Sterling shook his head. At first, maybe so, but not anymore. Now I admire her. The silence stretched between them. Caleb pressed his lips together. She deserves to know. Mr. Sterling looked at him intently. Yes, and we'll tell her when we get her out of there. Caleb felt his determination renewed. Now, more than ever, he had to find a way to clear Miss Beatrice's name. Because they weren't just fighting for the restaurant, they were fighting for their history. Caleb knew that every minute his grandmother spent in jail was an injustice. He couldn't let Zane and Miss Sharon win. After discovering that Mr. Sterling owed his life to his great-grandmother, his determination only grew. Now he had one more reason to fight. That night, when the apartment building was quiet and Clara was asleep with Miss Joyce, Caleb slipped out without a sound. He had a plan. He couldn't rely solely on the lawyer. He had to find evidence on his own. He knew that Zane was smart. He wouldn't leave easy traces to follow. But there was one person who might talk, one of the restaurant employees. Caleb arrived at the ruined restaurant and hid near the back door. He waited. A few minutes passed, and then he heard footsteps. It was Zane. He wasn't alone. The old woman is out of the game, said a voice Caleb immediately recognized. Miss Sharon. Caleb held his breath and ducked behind some boxes. Don't count your chickens yet, Zane replied. The kid is smart. Miss Sharon laughed. Please, what's a brat going to do against us? I don't know, but I don't like him snooping around. Caleb clenched his fists. They knew he was investigating. Sterling is also a problem, Zane added. He keeps pouring money into that restaurant as if he really believes he can save it. Well then, we have to deliver the final blow. Caleb felt a chill. What were they planning now? Leave it to me, Zane said confidently. When I'm done with this, the restaurant will be mine. Caleb couldn't wait any longer. He had to get out of there. He backed away slowly, making sure not to make a sound. But as he turned to run, he accidentally kicked a can. The metallic sound echoed in the alley. What was that? Miss Sharon asked. Caleb didn't wait to find out. He took off running with all his might. Behind him he heard Zane shout, Get him! He ran through the dark streets, dodging poles and jumping over puddles of dirty water. He knew every corner of the neighborhood. He heard footsteps behind him, but didn't stop. When he saw an open door, he slipped inside and hid behind some boxes. The footsteps got closer. I saw him come this way. Find him. Caleb held his breath. The footsteps moved away. He waited a few seconds and then ran off in the opposite direction. His heart was pounding. When he finally reached the apartment building, he was safe. But now he knew the truth. Zane and Miss Sharon didn't just want to destroy the restaurant. They wanted to take everything, and they would do whatever it took to achieve it. The day of Miss Beatrice's trial arrived faster than anyone expected. Caleb had found evidence against Zane. Mr. Sterling was using all his influence to speed up the process, and the lawyer had built a solid defense. But that didn't mean the battle was won. The courtroom was packed. Miss Beatrice, with her hands clasped on her lap, held her head high, though her heart was pounding. Mr. Sterling was by her side, firm as an ally she had never expected to have. Opposite them, Zane sat with an expression of absolute calm, as if he were sure everything would go his way. And behind him, almost like a shadow, was Miss Sharon. When the judge entered and struck the gavel against the bench, everyone stood. Case number 1324, the clerk announced. Beatrice Martin, accused of fraud and embezzlement. Caleb, sitting in the audience next to Clara, clenched his fists. He knew his grandmother was innocent, but the system wasn't always fair. The prosecutor stood up and walked slowly to the stand. Your Honor, the defendant, Beatrice Martin, was in charge of managing the funds of her restaurant. However, it has been discovered that large sums of money were diverted to personal accounts. This proves her guilt. The judge nodded and looked at the defense attorney. Anything to say before we continue? Miss Beatrice's lawyer stood up calmly. Of course, Your Honor. We have compelling evidence that will prove my client is innocent and that she was the victim of a plot to discredit her and take over her restaurant. A murmur swept through the room. Zane shifted in his seat, but his arrogant smile remained. He didn't seem worried. The judge gestured for the prosecutor to continue. We call the restaurant's accountant to testify about the money movements. A man in a dark suit stood up and walked to the stand. It was the same accountant who had handled the numbers since the restaurant opened. Could you tell us if there were any irregularities in the accounts? The prosecutor asked. The accountant nodded. Yes, large sums were transferred to personal accounts. And did those accounts belong to Beatrice Martin? The accountant hesitated for a moment. We don't know for sure. We only have the records. The defense attorney stood up. Your Honor, we have evidence that these transactions were made by Zane, the restaurant's chef. The murmurs grew in the courtroom. The judge struck the gavel. Silence. The lawyer continued. Your Honor, we have a document found by Miss Beatrice's grandson, Caleb, in Zane's office. It shows a transfer of a considerable sum to an anonymous account. The judge took the papers and reviewed them carefully. Mr. Prosecutor, why wasn't this investigated before? The prosecutor frowned and looked at his team. We were not aware of this evidence. Miss Sharon, who had been silent until then, leaned over and whispered something to Zane. The young man pressed his lips together but still didn't lose his composure. Miss Beatrice's lawyer asked for permission to call another witness. Your Honor, we have a key witness who can confirm that this was all a trap to frame Miss Beatrice. The judge nodded. Proceed. The courtroom doors opened, and a man with his head down entered. It was one of the restaurant's employees. Miss Beatrice recognized him immediately. He had worked with her since the opening, always silent, always avoiding trouble. State your name, the lawyer requested. Dale, what do you know about the accusations against Miss Martin? Dale swallowed and looked at Zane, who was now staring at him with a dangerous intensity. I saw things. What kind of things? The witness took a deep breath. One night, Zane was in the office after everyone had left. He was reviewing the restaurant's documents and making calls. When I walked in, he got nervous and told me it was none of my business. Did you hear anything in particular? Yes. I heard him mention Miss Sharon. He said everything was ready for Miss Sharon. Martin to be arrested. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The judge looked up. Are you saying that Zane and Miss Sharon conspired against the defendant? Dale nodded. Yes. Miss Beatrice closed her eyes for a moment. She knew Zane was dangerous, but now she had proof that he had never acted alone. The lawyer turned to the judge. Your Honor, with this statement, it is clear that my client was the victim of a trap. We ask that the charges against her be dropped and that an investigation be opened against the real culprits. The judge struck the gavel. We will take a short recess to deliberate. Zane stood up abruptly and left the courtroom with Miss Sharon following closely behind. They saw them leave. She whispered to Mr. Sterling. They're not going to stay quiet. Mr. Sterling nodded gravely. They still have cards up their sleeves. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, the judge re-entered and took her seat. After reviewing the evidence presented and hearing the testimonies, this court finds that Beatrice Martin is innocent of the charges against her. Caleb felt a lump in his throat as Clara hugged him. Grandma is free. But the judge wasn't finished. An investigation is also opened against Zane and Miss Sharon for fraud and conspiracy. Murmurs filled the room as Miss Beatrice's lawyer smiled. The judge struck the gavel one last time. The court has spoken. Justice, at last. In that moment, the truth was a powerful shield, and Miss Beatrice was finally free from the lies that had bound her. But as she celebrated this victory, her enemies were already retreating into the shadows to plan their next move, and as we'll see, this war is far from over. Miss Beatrice felt her legs tremble as she stood up. She was free, but as she hugged her grandchildren, her gaze fell on the courthouse doors. Miss Sharon and Zane had already disappeared, and Miss Beatrice knew they would not give up so easily. The trial was over, and Miss Beatrice was free, but the war was not yet won. From the car window, as Mr. Sterling drove her back home, Miss Beatrice watched the city pass by. For the first time in days, she could breathe with ease. Caleb and Clara were asleep in the back seat, exhausted from everything they had been through. The boy had been key in proving the truth, and Miss Beatrice couldn't be prouder. But she knew this wasn't the end. You haven't said a word since we left the courthouse, Mr. Sterling murmured, his eyes on the road. Miss Beatrice sighed. Because I know this isn't over. The businessman nodded gravely. No, it's not over. The question they both had in mind was the same. What would Miss Sharon do now? The restaurant was still standing, but it had been tainted by the controversy. Customers were still hesitant to return. The rumors didn't disappear easily. Miss Beatrice knew she would have to rebuild more than just the walls of the place. She would have to rebuild people's trust. But before she could begin, the threat returned. Miss Sharon was waiting for her in front of the restaurant when she arrived that morning, standing with her dark cardigan and a cynical smile on her lips. Miss Beatrice stopped in front of her, not lowering her gaze. What do you want now, Sharon? The woman let out a little laugh. You got out of jail faster than I expected. They couldn't prove anything against me. Not this time. Miss Beatrice clenched her fists. Get out of here. I didn't come to fight, Beatrice, miss, Sharon said, raising her hands in feigned calm. I came to give you an opportunity. Miss Beatrice frowned. An opportunity, miss? Sharon took an envelope from her purse and extended it. Sell the restaurant. Miss Beatrice felt as if she had been slapped. What did you say? I'm buying it from you, miss. Beatrice took the envelope and opened it. There was a check inside. The amount of money was more than she had ever seen in her life. With this, you could retire, Beatrice. Forget about everything. Miss Beatrice looked at her with disgust. "I'd rather lose everything than sell you my dream." Miss Sharon burst out laughing. "Your dream? Don't make me laugh. This place is already finished." Miss Beatrice tore the check into pieces. "If you think I'm going to give up, you don't know me at all." Miss Sharon's eyes shone with fury. "You're going to regret this, Beatrice." She turned and walked away. But Miss Beatrice knew that wasn't her last move. Not an hour had passed when Mr. Sterling arrived at the restaurant with bad news. "The suppliers are pulling out." Miss Beatrice felt a chill. "What?" "The ones who supply our ingredients have received threats. No one wants to sell to us." The woman felt her stomach sink. That Sharon. She hadn't been able to destroy her with lies, so now she was attacking where it hurt most. If they couldn't get ingredients, the restaurant couldn't function. Caleb heard everything and ran to his grandmother. "Grandma, what are we going to do?" Miss Beatrice took a deep breath. "We're going to fight." Caleb frowned. "But if no one wants to sell to us?" The woman looked at her grandson with determination. "If we can't buy, we'll cook with what we have." That night, instead of closing the restaurant, Miss Beatrice did something unexpected. She opened the doors and began to cook with the little that was left. The neighbors were the first to arrive, then some loyal customers. The people of the neighborhood had not abandoned her. The restaurant filled up again, and when Miss Sharon found out what was happening, she knew her enemy was stronger than she thought. But she hadn't given up yet, because her last move was yet to come. The restaurant had survived. Miss Beatrice had been freed. Customers were slowly starting to return, and Miss Sharon's shadow seemed to be fading. But there was still an enemy within, Zane. After the trial, his attitude had become more reserved. He didn't say a single word about the accusation against him, nor did he defend himself when it became clear that he had manipulated documents to frame Miss Beatrice. He simply continued working in the kitchen as if nothing had happened. That was what worried Miss Beatrice the most. Zane's silence was more dangerous than his words. But their victory was short-lived. A few days later, Mr. Sterling entered the kitchen with a grim expression. "Zane was released on bail," he announced. "And he's not staying quiet." It turned out, even without a job, Zane was determined to sow chaos. He began spreading rumors online, contacting food bloggers with fabricated stories of poor hygiene and mismanagement at the restaurant. Though fired, his shadow still loomed over them, proving that an enemy outside the walls could be just as dangerous as one within. Caleb frowned. "But he tried to steal the restaurant from you." Miss Beatrice put a hand on his shoulder. "Those who attack head-on are easy to defeat, but those who wait in the shadows must be watched more carefully." Caleb said nothing, but something inside him told him his grandmother was right. Zane wasn't finished. That night, when the restaurant closed, Miss Beatrice decided to stay late to check the inventories. She knew that after everything that had happened, she had to make sure everything was in order. But as she reviewed the numbers, a detail made her frown. Ingredients were missing. It wasn't a large amount, but enough to catch her attention. She closed the notebook and headed to the kitchen. Something wasn't right. When she arrived, she saw Zane putting a black bag inside his backpack. "Taking something?" she asked in a firm voice. Zane didn't startle. He calmly closed the backpack and left it on the table. "Just checking some things. Don't lie." "I saw the numbers. Ingredients are missing." Zane smiled mockingly. "And what? Are you going to accuse me of stealing, miss?" Beatrice crossed her arms. "If you have something to say it now." Zane took his backpack and slung it over his shoulder. "You don't need to test my loyalty, Miss Beatrice. From the beginning, you knew I wasn't here to help you." Miss Beatrice pressed her lips together. "Then what do you want?" Zane took a step forward. "I want what I deserve." "And what do you think you deserve?" "This restaurant." The silence in the kitchen became heavy. Miss Beatrice stood still, studying him. You think you can take away what I built? I don't think so. I know so. Miss Sharon failed. You will too. Miss Sharon played it safe. I don't. Zane left the backpack on the table and took out his phone. He pressed a few buttons and then left it on the table. On the screen, a video began to play. It was Miss Beatrice in the kitchen, preparing a stew. But there was something strange. The images were edited. They made it seem like she was using spoiled ingredients. Miss Beatrice felt her blood boil. What is this? Zane smiled. A little video that could ruin your reputation forever. Miss Beatrice didn't take her eyes off the screen. And what do you want in exchange for not publishing it? Zane turned off the phone. Let me be in charge of the kitchen. Miss Beatrice laughed humorlessly. Never. Zane sighed and took his phone. Then let's see what people say when they see this on social media. Miss Beatrice watched him leave the kitchen. She knew Zane wasn't joking, but she also knew one thing. If she wanted to beat him, she had to be smarter than him, because now it was a battle for honor. Miss Beatrice knew Zane wouldn't just stand by. His threat to ruin her reputation with a manipulated video still hung in the air. But instead of cowering, she prepared to face him. The night after her last encounter with him, Miss Beatrice sat at the table of her small home with Caleb and Clara by her side. The restaurant was in danger once again. But this time, she wasn't going to wait for him to destroy her. We have to get ahead of him, she said firmly. Caleb, with the photo of his great-grandmother still in his pocket, nodded. If Zane wants people to doubt you, then we have to make them hear the truth before he can attack us. Clara, in her sweet yet confident voice, said something that surprised everyone. What if we make a video? Miss Beatrice frowned. A video? Yes, like the ones people watch on their phones. We can tell your story, Grandma. Tell everyone who you really are. Caleb slammed the table with excitement. Clara's right. If Zane wants to use a video to destroy you, then we'll use one to show who you are. Miss Beatrice had never thought of something like that, but it made sense. Mr. Sterling arrived shortly after, and when he heard the children's idea, he smiled. It's risky, but it might work. That same night, Mr. Sterling got a camera and a recording crew. If they were going to tell Miss Beatrice's story, they would do it right. The recording began in the restaurant's kitchen, with Miss Beatrice preparing her famous Brunswick stew. Every movement of her hands spoke for itself. Then she sat in front of the camera and told her story. I am Beatrice Martin. All my life, I have cooked with my heart. I learned from my mother and my grandmother. For me, food is not a business. It's love, it's tradition, it's family. She spoke of her beginnings at the Sweet Auburn Curb Market, of how she had fought to feed her grandchildren, of the injustices she had faced. They have tried to take everything from me many times, but I'm still here, and I will stay here. When they finished recording, Miss Beatrice felt something strange in her chest. Not fear, not doubt, just determination. Now, how do we get people to see it? She asked. Caleb smiled. Leave that to me. The video was posted on all social media platforms. Caleb shared it in every corner of the internet, and soon, something incredible began to happen. First, a few comments. My grandmother also sold food on the street. What a beautiful story. This lady cooks with more love than any expensive restaurant. Then, more people started coming to the restaurant. Not curious customers, but people who wanted to support her. In less than 2 days, the video went viral. When Zane tried to post his manipulated video, it was too late. No one believed him. Instead of ruining Miss Beatrice's reputation, he made it even stronger. But while the restaurant celebrated its triumphant return, Zane watched everything from a distance, and his expression was one of pure fury. He wasn't finished. He still had one last card to play. The restaurant was full again. After the video that Caleb and Clara published, the public rallied in support of Miss Beatrice. The tables filled up quickly, and the kitchen once again had that atmosphere of hurried but satisfying work. It was as if the storm had finally passed. But Miss Beatrice knew that wasn't true. Since her last conversation with Zane, something inside her wouldn't let her rest. The young chef was not one to accept defeat easily, and although he hadn't done anything so far, Miss Beatrice felt that he was waiting for the exact moment to strike. The confirmation of her suspicions came one night when Caleb entered the kitchen with a tense face. "Grandma, you have to see this." He handed her his phone, and Miss Beatrice looked at the screen. It was an article published on a food blog. Beatrice's kitchen still in the eye of the storm. Former employees claim that conditions in the kitchen are not the best and that the food does not always meet quality standards. Miss Beatrice felt a chill. Who wrote this? I don't know. But in the comments, people are saying that Zane is talking to journalists. Miss Beatrice closed her eyes for a moment. She wasn't surprised by that boy. "Mr. Sterling entered the kitchen at that moment. "I already heard," he said gravely. "Zane is talking to every media outlet that will listen." "And what is he saying?" "Miss?" Beatrice asked, although deep down she already knew. "Mr. Sterling," sighed, "that you don't manage the restaurant well, that you're too old to run the kitchen, that this place only survives because of the pity people feel for you." Caleb clenched his fists. "He's a liar." Miss Beatrice calmly placed the phone on the table. "It doesn't matter what he says. It matters what people taste." The next day, Zane entered the kitchen as if nothing had happened, as if he weren't betraying everyone with his statements. Miss Beatrice was waiting for him by the work table. "So, you're famous now." Zane smiled mockingly. "I'm just saying what everyone thinks." "Everyone? Don't play dumb, Zane. You know that many here think you should retire." The kitchen fell silent. The other employees glanced at them, uncomfortable. "I know what I'm doing," Miss Beatrice replied firmly. Zane crossed his arms. "Right. So tell me, what are you going to do when people start to believe me?" Miss Beatrice looked at him without blinking. "I'm going to keep cooking." Zane let out a laugh. "That's not a strategy. It is when the food speaks for itself." The young chef shook his head. "You still don't get it. In this business, perception is everything." "Not in mine." Zane looked at her with a mixture of contempt and frustration. "You'll see, Beatrice. This is just the beginning." That night, when the restaurant closed, Miss Beatrice stayed in the kitchen longer than usual. She knew Zane wasn't lying. This was just beginning. Miss Beatrice knew Zane hadn't said his last word. He had lost control of the restaurant. He had failed to destroy her reputation. And now, he only had one option left. Desperation. And when an enemy is desperate, he becomes dangerous. That night, after closing the restaurant, Miss Beatrice decided to stay a while longer in the kitchen. She felt that something was about to happen. "Grandma, are you sure you don't want me to stay with you?" Caleb asked, worried. Miss Beatrice stroked his hair tenderly. "No, my child. Go home with Clara. I'll be fine." Caleb frowned. He didn't like leaving her alone. "If anything happens, call me." "Miss Poord," Beatrice smiled and gave him a kiss on the forehead. "Go on, go." When the restaurant was empty, Miss Beatrice turned off the lights and sat at the central table in the kitchen. The silence was absolute. But then she heard a noise in the back. She stood up slowly. "Who's there?" There was no answer. She took a knife from the table and walked cautiously towards the storage room. Her heart was pounding. When she opened the door, she saw a shadow move among the shelves. "Come out." The figure turned slowly. It was Zane. But he wasn't alone. There was another man with him, dressed in dark clothes and a ski mask. Miss Beatrice gripped the knife tighter. "What are you doing here?" Zane smiled mockingly. "Just making sure this place has a proper ending." The man with the ski mask took a lighter from his pocket. Miss Beatrice felt a chill. "Are you going to try to burn it down again? No restaurant, no evidence?" Zane replied. Miss Beatrice took a deep breath. She wasn't afraid. "You won't succeed." "And who's going to stop me?" "You?" At that moment, the sound of a switch was heard. The light in the storage room suddenly turned on, illuminating Zane and the masked man. Behind them, in the doorway, stood Mr. Sterling and Caleb. Caleb was holding his phone with the camera on. "I've got it all on video." Zane turned sharply. "What?" Mr. Sterling took out his cell phone. "And I've already called the police." Zane gritted his teeth and looked at his accomplice. "Run!" The masked man tried to flee, but two officers were already blocking the entrance. "Hands up!" Zane slowly raised his hands, his face red with fury. "This isn't over." Miss Beatrice looked him in the eyes. In the end, it wasn't a grand battle, but a quiet moment of truth captured on camera. Zane's desperate final act was no match for the steady courage of a woman who refused to be broken. With one enemy finally vanquished, the path was clearing, but the biggest secrets were still waiting to be revealed. "For you it is." The officers handcuffed them and took them out of the restaurant. Caleb ran to his grandmother and hugged her tightly. "I knew they would try something." Miss Beatrice stroked his head. "Thank you for coming back." Mr. Sterling crossed his arms. "I figured Zane wouldn't stay quiet." Miss Beatrice sighed and looked at the restaurant around her. They had tried to destroy it so many times, but now everything was about to change. With Zane and Miss Sharon out of the way, the restaurant would finally have its chance to shine. The dawn in Atlanta brought with it an air of renewal. After all they had been through, Miss Beatrice woke up with a feeling she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The restaurant was no longer in danger. Zane and Miss Sharon had been defeated, but now came the hardest part: raising it from the ashes. That morning, Miss Beatrice arrived early at the location. She stopped at the entrance and observed every corner. The place still bore the marks of the battles it had faced, but it was still standing. "Today, we start anew," she murmured to herself. Caleb and Clara came running shortly after. "Grandma!" shouted Clara excitedly. "There's a line outside." Miss Beatrice frowned. "A line?" Caleb smiled. "A lot of people want to try your food after everything that happened." Miss Beatrice went out and looked in amazement. A long line of customers stretched down the sidewalk. Some were old customers who had never abandoned her, but others were new, drawn by the story of struggle and perseverance. Mr. Sterling arrived in his car and got out with a smile. "Looks like we have a lot of work to do." Miss Beatrice took a deep breath and smiled. It was time to begin. The first orders began to come out of the kitchen quickly. The waiters could barely keep up. The fried pies flew off the trays, the Brunswick stew ran out faster than expected, and the aroma of the cooking filled every corner of the restaurant. Miss Beatrice worked at the same pace as when she sold at the market, with patience, with passion. But the most special moment was when an elderly man with a time-worn face approached her with teary eyes. "Ma'am, your food reminded me of my mother." Miss Beatrice felt a lump in her throat. "Thank you, son. It's an honor." The man took her hands gratefully. "Don't let anything or anyone change this." Miss Beatrice smiled warmly. "Never." That night, when the last customer left, Beatrice stood at the restaurant door, watching the city lights. Caleb sat beside her. "Grandma, what's next?" Miss Beatrice looked at him and stroked his hair. "Now, we're going to make this restaurant eternal." But what they didn't know was that there was one last secret to be discovered, one that would change everything forever. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window as Miss Beatrice prepared the first stew of the day. It was a peaceful morning, different from all the previous ones. For the first time in a long time, there was no immediate threat, no rumors, no enemy in the shadows waiting to attack. There was peace. Caleb and Clara ran in enthusiastically. "Grandma, I saw an important critic today," Caleb announced excitedly. "Mr. Sterling says that if he likes the food, he'll give us a review on TV," added Clara, her eyes shining. Miss Beatrice smiled. "Then we'll give him a stew he'll never forget." Throughout the day, the restaurant filled up quickly. The atmosphere was different. There was energy, excitement, anticipation. Miss Beatrice worked with concentration, checking each dish before it left for the tables. She knew this was her chance to prove once again that her food was more than just a dish. Mr. Chapter, R.M. Sterling supervised the service with his usual elegance. "Everything is going perfectly," he said, satisfied. "This place is about to become a landmark in the city." Miss Beatrice nodded. She could feel it in the air. But then a noise at the back door made her turn. "I'll go see what it is," said Caleb, running before she could stop him. When he reached the alley, he stopped short. There was a cardboard box with an envelope on top. Caleb looked around but saw no one. Someone had left it without being noticed. He took the envelope and opened it. His eyes widened in surprise. Inside were old documents, papers, and deeds with signatures he didn't recognize. But at the top, a name made him freeze. Mr. Arthur Sterling. Caleb swallowed and ran back to the restaurant. "Grandma?" Miss Beatrice looked at him, worried. "What's wrong, Caleb?" He placed the documents on the table. "Someone left this at the door." Mr. Sterling approached and took the papers. His face completely changed. This can't be." Miss Beatrice looked at him intently. "What do those papers say, Arthur?" Mr. Sterling took a deep breath before answering. "They say this restaurant should never have been mine." Miss Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you saying?" Mr. Sterling looked up, and for the first time his eyes reflected fear. "I'm saying there's a secret that changes everything." Caleb and Clara looked at each other. They knew that what they were about to discover could change their lives forever. The restaurant was more alive than ever. After so many struggles, Miss Beatrice felt that she had finally recovered what they had tried to snatch from her so many times. The kitchen was full of familiar aromas, of laughter, of a warmth that only honest work could generate. But inside, a shadow still troubled her. Mr. Sterling's secret. She couldn't forget the words Caleb had told her about the connection between her mother and the Sterling family. There were too many intertwined secrets, too many coincidences. And the truth, sooner or later, always comes to light. That night, after the restaurant closed, Miss Beatrice stayed in the kitchen, cleaning with slow movements. She knew Mr. Sterling would arrive soon. He didn't take long to appear at the door, hands in his pockets, and the same pensive expression as always. "Everything all right, Beatrice?" She left the cloth on the table and looked at him intently. "No. I need you to tell me the truth." Mr. Sterling sighed. "About what?" "About my mother." "About your family." The man remained silent. His face showed no surprise. "You already know part of the story," he said calmly. "Your mother worked in my house when I was a child. That's not all." Mr. Sterling looked down and took a seat at the kitchen table. He was silent for a long moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "When I was a child, my father was a cruel man. My mother put up with him for many years, but there were times when I felt her only comfort was the kitchen and the people who worked in it." He paused. "Your mother was young when she came to our house, but there was something about her that made her different. Not only did she cook well, but she had character. She had strength. She didn't let anyone walk all over her, not even my father." Miss Beatrice felt a chill. "And what happened?" he noticed her. The silence became thick. I don't know exactly what happened that night. She disappeared. I just know that my father was furious. My mother ordered me not to ask questions, and days later, your mother was no longer there. Miss Beatrice felt her heart pound. Are you saying that your father? Mr. Sterling looked at her seriously. I don't know. But I suspect she fled because something terrible happened. The lump in Miss Beatrice's throat grew tighter. Her mother had never spoken of that time in her life. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I wasn't sure if it was my place too. But now, I think you need to know. Miss Beatrice took a deep breath. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. What was your father's name? Mr. Sterling narrowed his eyes. Walter Sterling. The name fell like a weight on Miss Beatrice's chest. She had heard that name before, in her mother's whispers when she thought no one was listening. Her whole world seemed to falter. The reasons why her mother fled, the invisible scars she always carried. And now Miss Beatrice understood what this meant. She looked at Mr. Sterling with a mixture of confusion and pain. What else are you hiding from me? Mr. Sterling took a deep breath. Beatrice, there's something else you should know. Miss Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. Tell me. Mr. Sterling looked her. That night, Miss Beatrice couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. She remembered her mother, the strong woman who never spoke of the past. Now she understood why. When she finally managed to close her eyes, she was awakened by the sound of the telephone. Hello? A male voice answered on the other end. Miss Martin? I have information about Walter Sterling. Miss Beatrice sat up in bed. Who is this? Just someone who knows the truth. Miss Beatrice's heart pounded. What truth? The truth about your mother and what Walter Sterling did to her. The silence became heavy. If you want answers, meet me in the main square in Inman Park at 10 inches the morning. Miss Beatrice gripped the phone tightly. And why should I trust you? Because you deserve to know the whole story. The line went dead. Miss Beatrice stared at the phone. She knew this meeting could change everything, and although she was afraid, she knew she couldn't run from the past forever. The day dawned with a heavy air in Miss Beatrice's heart. She had received a call that could change everything. The mystery about her mother, the truth buried for decades, was about to come to light, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to hear it. But she couldn't live with the uncertainty. At 10 o'clock sharp, she arrived at the square in Inman Park. The sun shone on the cobblestones. The aroma of coffee and freshly baked bread floated in the air, but for Miss Beatrice, everything felt distant. She scanned the crowd until she saw a gray-haired man sitting on a bench, a wide-brimmed hat partially covering his face. The same man who had called her. She approached with firm steps. Are you the one who called me? The man looked up and regarded her calmly. Yes, Miss Martin. Please have a seat. Miss Beatrice did, but without taking her eyes off him. Tell me what you know. The man sighed and laced his fingers over his lap. I knew your mother when she worked for the Sterlings. I was just a young assistant in the house, but I saw more than I should have. Miss Beatrice felt her chest tighten. What happened to my mother? The man took a few seconds to answer. Your mother didn't just run away. She fled because she was pregnant. The air seemed to vanish. Miss? Beatrice felt the whole world stop. What are you saying? The man looked at her seriously. Your mother was expecting a child by Walter Sterling. Miss Beatrice's heart hammered against her chest. That's impossible. She fled to protect herself and her baby. Miss Beatrice shook her head. Her mother had never said anything. I don't understand. The man took an envelope from his bag and handed it to her. Here is the proof. Miss Beatrice took it with trembling hands. When she opened the envelope, she saw old documents, letters with the Sterling family seal, and on one of them, her mother's name. But the most shocking thing was the last sheet, a birth certificate with a name that left her breathless. Arthur Sterling. Miss Beatrice's hands began to shake. It couldn't be true. No, it can't be. The man sighed. Mr. Arthur Sterling isn't just a man who helped you, Miss Beatrice. He's your brother. With just 3 words, the entire foundation of Beatrice's world crumbled. The man who had been her savior, her benefactor, was connected to her by the very blood she never knew they shared. This secret doesn't just change her future, it rewrites her entire past. The world seemed to crumble around her. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about her family, had been a lie. And now she had to face the truth. Beatrice walked away from the park in a daze, the city sounds fading into a dull roar. Brother. The word felt foreign, impossible. She looked at her own hands, the same hands that had cooked for him, and saw them differently. She thought of his kindness, his unwavering support. Was it pity? Guilt? Or was it something deeper, an unconscious pull of shared blood? A wave of anger washed over her, anger at the man who had fathered them both and discarded one like trash, anger at a lifetime of secrets. But beneath the anger was a profound, aching sadness for the mother who had carried this burden alone, and for the 2 children of the same man who had lived worlds apart, their connection a ghost story neither of them knew. Miss Beatrice felt the blood boil in her veins. Sister of Mr. Sterling, the illegitimate daughter of Walter Sterling. All her life she had believed she came from a humble, hard-working family, with no ties to the powerful people who had always looked down on her. Now she discovered that her history was connected to the very family that had destroyed her mother. The envelope with the documents trembled in her hands. It can't be, she whispered. The man in front of her nodded gravely. It is. Mr. Sterling and you share the same blood. Miss. Beatrice felt like she couldn't breathe. How had she lived so many years without knowing? The man continued. Walter Sterling never acknowledged your mother or you, but he always knew the truth. Miss Beatrice felt a chill. How do you know? The man took another paper from the envelope and handed it to her. It was a letter written by Walter Sterling. With trembling hands, Miss Beatrice opened it and began to read. If you are reading this, it means my time has ended. I was never a good man, and even less a good father. My pride prevented me from recognizing the daughter I had with a woman I should never have hurt. The only woman who truly saw me for what I was, a coward. Miss Beatrice felt her chest ache. Her mother had fled not only to protect herself, but to protect her. This changes nothing, she said in a trembling voice. The man looked at her with understanding. No, but it explains many things. Miss Beatrice closed her eyes. She couldn't take it anymore. I need time. The man nodded. Take it. But remember that the truth, however painful, can also set you free. Miss Beatrice got up and left the square. She couldn't stay there another second. That night, back in her home, Miss Beatrice sat at the table with Walter Sterling's letter in front of her. Caleb, who had noticed her silence since she returned, sat beside her. Grandma, what's wrong? Miss Beatrice looked at him tenderly and stroked his head. Life gives us answers when we least expect them, my child. Caleb frowned. Is it about Mr. Sterling? Miss Beatrice nodded slowly. Yes, my child, he's more than a partner. Caleb looked at her with wide eyes. What do you mean? Miss Beatrice took a deep breath. He's my brother. The boy felt the floor move beneath his feet. Our uncle? Miss Beatrice nodded. Caleb was silent for a few seconds, then he took the letter and looked at it seriously. And does he know? Miss Beatrice felt a chill. If Mr. Sterling already knew the truth and never told her, it meant he also had his own secrets. She stood up and took her coat. I'm going to see him. Caleb wanted to go with her, but she shook her head. This is something I have to do alone. When she arrived at Mr. Sterling's office, she found him standing by the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He turned slowly when he saw her enter. "I knew you would come." Miss Beatrice closed the door behind her. "How long have you known?" Mr. Sterling put the glass on the table. He didn't try to deny it. "For a long time." Miss Beatrice's heart pounded. "Why did you never tell me?" Mr. Sterling sighed. "Because I didn't know if you wanted to know." "I had a right to know." "For what?" he asked harshly. "So you could carry the weight of a last name that only brought suffering?" Miss Beatrice felt a lump in her throat. "To know who I really am." "Mr." Sterling approached slowly and looked her in the eyes. "Beatrice, you always knew who you were." She pressed her lips together tightly. "Did you hate him?" Mr. Sterling didn't answer immediately. "For many years, yes. But then I understood that the best revenge was not to become him." Miss Beatrice felt a tear slide down her cheek. "My mother suffered because of that man. I know. And it hurts me as much as it hurts you." She took a deep breath. "And now what do we do?" "Mr." Sterling smiled slightly. "We live, just as we always have." Miss Beatrice closed her eyes for a moment. She couldn't change the past, but she could decide what to do with her future. And she knew exactly where to start. "Tomorrow, when the sun comes up, we will cook again." Mr. Sterling nodded. "It was always our best way to heal." But before they could continue, Mr. Sterling's phone rang. He answered it, and his expression changed immediately. "What's wrong?" He paused and looked at Miss Beatrice seriously. "Beatrice, you have to see this." He showed her the phone. Miss Beatrice felt her blood run cold. In the news, the name Miss Sharon appeared again. And this time, it wasn't about an attack against her. Something was about to happen, something that would change their lives forever. Miss Beatrice stared at the screen of Mr. Sterling's phone. Miss Sharon's name was back in the headlines. "Mysterious disappearance of local businesswoman." The headline made no sense. Miss Sharon was no victim. She was the person who had tried to ruin her life. But there was her face in the news photo, with the description that no one had heard from her in several days. Mr. Sterling frowned. "I don't like this at all." Miss Beatrice put the phone on the table. "I don't know what to think." "Maybe it's a trap," Mr. Sterling added. "Or maybe someone made her disappear before she could sink any further." Caleb, who had been listening from the door, came closer. "What if she's setting another trap for us?" Miss Beatrice looked at him, uncertain. It was possible. But before she could answer, Mr. Sterling's phone rang again. He answered quickly. "Yes?" He listened in silence, his face tensing. "Understood." He hung up and looked at Miss Beatrice seriously. "They found her." The silence filled the room. "Where?" "In a hospital." Miss Beatrice felt a chill. The last time she saw Miss Sharon, the woman was full of hate, but also in tireless desire for revenge. What happened to her? "I don't know. But I think we should find out." The hospital was in a remote part of the city. It wasn't a luxurious place, but a discreet, almost hidden facility. When Miss Beatrice and Mr. Sterling entered, the smell of disinfectant and the cold lights made a knot form in her stomach. She had never imagined Miss Sharon in a hospital bed. The receptionist directed them to a room down the last hallway. Upon entering, Miss Beatrice was met with a shocking image. Miss Beatrice! Sharon was lying down, her face pale, one arm in a cast, and bruises on her face. She looked weak, as if she had been through hell. But her eyes still had the same fire as always. When she saw her, she smiled mockingly. "Look at you, Beatrice. Always so noble." Miss Beatrice crossed her arms. "What happened to you?" "Miss!" Sharon laughed softly, but the sound turned into a cough. "The same allies I had, they betrayed me." Miss Beatrice and Mr. Sterling exchanged glances. Zane? Mr. Sterling asked. Miss Sharon shook her head. Zane is nothing but a pawn. There's someone else. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Who? Miss Sharon took a deep breath before speaking. Someone who also wants to see you fall, Beatrice. But unlike me, this person has no limits. Miss Beatrice felt a chill. Tell me who it is. Miss Sharon looked at her with a mixture of mockery and resignation. You'll find out soon enough. Miss Beatrice's heart pounded. She thought her fight was over, but she was wrong. There was still an enemy in the shadows. Miss Beatrice left the hospital with slow steps. The weight of the truth was crushing her. Walter Sterling, her grandfather, the man who had destroyed her mother's life and forced her to flee, was alive. She didn't know what to feel. Rage, fear, confusion. Mr. Sterling walked by her side in silence. He too had just discovered that his father was still alive. What will you do? He finally asked. Miss Beatrice pressed her lips together. I don't know. The restaurant was full when they arrived. People had come to trust her again. The waiters could barely keep up. The kitchen was at its peak, and the aroma of Brunswick stew floated in the air like a warm hug. Caleb and Clara ran to meet them. Grandma! Shouted Clara, hugging her tightly. Caleb looked at her with concern. Is everything okay? Miss Beatrice stroked his hair. Yes, my child, everything is fine. But it wasn't, because deep down she knew there was still something left to resolve. That same night, after the restaurant closed, Miss Beatrice sat in her office and took out Walter Sterling's letter. She had read it so many times that the words were already engraved in her mind. If you are reading this, it means my time has ended. But it hadn't ended. He was still out there, somewhere. What would you do, Mama? She whispered, looking at her mother's photo. She knew the answer. Her mother had fled because she had no choice, but she wasn't her mother. She faced things. Miss Beatrice picked up the phone and dialed the number that was in the letter, her grandfather's number. It rang 3 times before someone answered. I knew you would call. The voice was deep, slow, as if in no hurry. Miss Beatrice felt a chill. I need to see you. There was a silence. Inman Park. Tomorrow at 3. The call ended. Miss Beatrice put the phone on the table and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would face her past. The cafe in Inman Park was almost empty when she arrived. The afternoon sun illuminated the wooden tables. The murmur of the fountain in the center of the square was the only thing breaking the silence. And then she saw him, an elderly man with white hair and a stooped back, a cane resting against the table. His dark eyes locked onto hers. Miss Beatrice felt her breath catch. This man had sealed her mother's fate. She approached with firm steps and sat across from him. So, you're Beatrice. She didn't answer. Walter Sterling smiled faintly, a ghost of a smile. You have her eyes. Miss Beatrice met his gaze, not with the coldness he deserved, but with the quiet strength she had earned. Why did you ask me here? She asked, her voice steady. He let out a long, weary sigh. A dying man's foolish hope, perhaps, to see the life that grew from the wreckage I made. He looked down at his frail hands. I am not looking for your forgiveness, Beatrice. It is not mine to ask for. For a long moment, Beatrice was silent. She looked at this old, broken man and felt nothing. Not hatred, not pity, just a vast, quiet emptiness where the pain used to be. He was just a man, a chapter in a story that was no longer about him. My mother, Beatrice said softly, more to herself than to him. She was the strong one. She fled, she survived, and she raised me with love, not bitterness. My strength is her legacy. She stood up, the afternoon sun warming her back. I did not come here for you. I came here for me. To close a door. She turned to leave, not looking back. Her story was not in this cafe, with this man. Her story was waiting for her, in a warm kitchen that smelled of home. Miss Beatrice finally understood that they could take her stall and her peace, but they could never take away the soul she poured into every dish. Her true legacy wasn't a name steeped in pain, but the love passed down through generations in a simple recipe. She wants you to know that your value isn't measured